The world of Macragge stood as a beacon of civilization within the Ultramar sector, its marble cities and ordered provinces, a stark contrast to the barbarism that had consumed much of humanity during the Age of Strife. When the infant Primarch's gestation pod crashed into the northern polar regions of this world, it marked the beginning of a legend that would reshape not only Macragge, but the entire galaxy. The pod was discovered by Roboute Guilliman, one of the two consuls who ruled the civilized southern regions of Macragge, a man whose own character would prove instrumental in shaping the future lord of the 13th Legion. Unlike many of his brother Primarchs who were raised in harsh circumstances or primitive societies, Roboute Guilliman found himself immersed in a sophisticated political structure from his earliest days. Roboute Guilliman recognized the extraordinary nature of his adopted son almost immediately. The child displayed an intellect that surpassed seasoned administrators and a natural grasp of complex political concepts that would have challenged experienced statesmen. Within the halls of Connor's palace, young Roboute absorbed lessons in governance, military strategy, and the delicate art of statecraft that would later prove invaluable during the Great Crusade. Macragge's political system operated as a form of enlightened oligarchy, where the consuls balanced the needs of various city-states and provinces through careful negotiation and strategic planning. This environment provided Guilliman with a unique education in the practical realities of ruling diverse populations with competing interests. He observed firsthand how effective leadership required not just military prowess, but also the ability to inspire loyalty through competent administration and fair governance. The young Primarch spent countless hours studying historical texts, analyzing battle reports from Macragge's conflicts with the barbarous northern tribes, and participating in the complex diplomatic negotiations that maintained peace between the southern city-states. The influence of Ultramar's structured society extended far beyond mere political education. Guilliman learned to appreciate the interconnected nature of civilization, how agricultural production supported urban populations, how trade routes enabled prosperity, and how military strength protected the foundations that allowed culture and learning to flourish. This holistic understanding of societal function would later manifest in his approach to both warfare and governance, where he consistently viewed military campaigns not as isolated conflicts, but as components of larger strategic objectives aimed at building sustainable imperial rule. Roboute Guilliman's own character proved equally formative in shaping his adopted son's worldview. The elder Guilliman embodied the ideals of duty, honor, and service to the greater good that would become hallmarks of the Ultramarines Legion. He demonstrated through personal example how true leadership meant placing the welfare of one's people above personal ambition, a lesson that resonated deeply with the young Primarch's innate sense of responsibility. Under Connor's guidance, Guilliman developed an appreciation for the burden of command and the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives. The political structure of Ultramar also exposed Guilliman to the challenges of maintaining unity among diverse populations. The various worlds and city-states within the sector each possessed their own cultures, traditions, and local concerns, yet they functioned as a cohesive whole through careful coordination and mutual respect. This experience taught Guilliman the importance of flexibility in leadership, understanding when to enforce uniform standards and when to accommodate local variations for the sake of overall stability and effectiveness. When the Emperor of Mankind finally arrived on Macragge, the meeting between father and son represented a convergence of destinies that would reshape the galaxy. The Master of Mankind found in Guilliman not a feral warrior king or a primitive tribal leader, but a sophisticated ruler who had already demonstrated exceptional capability in governing a multi-world domain. The Emperor's golden form cast long shadows across the marble floors of Connor's palace as he met with the young Primarch, and in that encounter, both father and son recognized the profound connection that bound them together. Guilliman's acceptance of his true heritage and the Great Crusade's purpose came without the hesitation or resistance that marked some of his brothers' reunions with their father. His education in statecraft and his exposure to Ultramar's complex political realities had prepared him to understand the monumental scope of the Emperor's vision. The concept of uniting humanity under a single banner, bringing order to the chaos that had fragmented human civilization, aligned perfectly with Guilliman's own experiences in maintaining unity among the diverse populations of Ultramar. The Emperor found in Guilliman a son who could immediately grasp the logistical and administrative challenges inherent in conquering and ruling a galaxy spanning empire. Where other Primarchs might focus primarily on the military aspects of the Great Crusade, Guilliman understood that lasting conquest required not just victory in battle, but the establishment of sustainable governance structures that could maintain imperial rule across vast distances and diverse populations. This understanding made him invaluable to the Emperor's grand design, as the Great Crusade would require not just conquerors, but administrators capable of building the Imperium from the ground up. The physical presence of Roboute Guilliman commanded immediate respect and attention. Standing taller than even the most imposing Astartes, his frame carried the perfect proportions that marked all Primarchs as works of the Emperor's genetic artistry. His features possessed a classical nobility that seemed carved from the finest marble, with piercing blue eyes that could assess a battlefield situation or analyze complex logistical data with equal precision. His voice carried the authority of absolute command, yet retained the measured tones of a practiced diplomat capable of inspiring loyalty through reasoned argument rather than mere intimidation. Guilliman's mental capabilities far exceeded even his impressive physical attributes. His strategic genius manifested not just in tactical brilliance on the battlefield, but in an unprecedented ability to coordinate multiple simultaneous campaigns across vast theaters of operation. He could process enormous amounts of information, identifying patterns and connections that escaped other commanders, and translate complex strategic objectives into practical operational plans that his subordinates could execute effectively. This intellectual capacity extended to administrative matters, where he demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to organize supply chains, coordinate production schedules, and manage the countless details required to sustain military operations on an interstellar scale. The natural leadership capabilities that marked Guilliman from his earliest days on Crag manifested in his ability to inspire absolute loyalty without resorting to fear or intimidation. His subordinates followed him not because they feared the consequences of disobedience, but because they genuinely believed in his competence and trusted his judgment. This quality proved particularly valuable when he assumed command of the 13th Legion, as it allowed him to implement sweeping changes to their organization and doctrine without triggering the resistance that might have met such reforms from a less respected leader. When Guilliman first encountered the 13th Legion, they bore the designation of the Warborn, a name that reflected their origins as one of the early Space Marine formations created during the unification of Terra. These warriors had already established a reputation for disciplined combat effectiveness, but they lacked the distinctive character and specialized doctrine that would later make the Ultramarines legendary throughout the galaxy. The Legion's existing culture emphasized martial prowess and tactical flexibility, providing Guilliman with an excellent foundation upon which to build his vision of what Space Marines could become. The transformation of the war born into the Ultramarines represented more than a simple change of designation or heraldry. Guilliman recognized that the Great Crusade would require Space Marine legions capable of operating as more than just elite assault forces. They needed to function as the instruments through which the Imperium would be built and maintained, serving not only as conquerors, but as the guardians and administrators of the worlds they brought into compliance. This vision required fundamental changes to how the Legion organized itself, trained its warriors, and approached the challenges of interstellar warfare. Under Guilliman's guidance, the 13th Legion began developing the comprehensive doctrines and organizational structures that would become known as the Codex Astartes. These innovations extended far beyond mere tactical formations or weapons employment techniques. Guilliman instituted systematic approaches to logistics, intelligence gathering, planetary governance, and the countless other functions that effective military operations required. He established training regimens that produced not just superior warriors, but thinking soldiers capable of adapting to unexpected situations and taking initiative when circumstances demanded independent action. The Primarch's approach to Legion organization reflected his understanding of the interconnected nature of military effectiveness. He recognized that even the most skilled individual warriors would fail if they lacked adequate supplies, accurate intelligence, or clear communication with their commanders. Therefore, he devoted as much attention to developing the Legion's support capabilities as he did to honing their combat skills. This holistic approach to military organization would later prove decisive in numerous campaigns throughout the Great Crusade. Guilliman's influence on the 13th Legion extended to their recruitment and training practices as well. Drawing upon his experience with Ultramar's diverse populations, he established recruitment protocols that identified candidates not just for their physical capabilities, but for their intellectual potential and capacity for leadership. The Legion began producing Space Marines who could function effectively as diplomats, administrators, and strategic planners in addition to their primary role as elite warriors. This versatility would prove invaluable as the Great Crusade expanded and the challenges of governing conquered worlds became increasingly complex. The transformation of the 13th Legion under Guilliman's command began with a systematic restructuring that would serve as the foundation for all future Ultramarines operations. When the Primarch first assumed leadership of his sons, he encountered a legion that numbered approximately 80,000 Astartes, already substantial by the standards of the early Great Crusade. However, Guilliman recognized that raw numbers meant little without proper organization and clear doctrine. His first major reform involved the establishment of standardized company structures, each containing exactly 100 Space Marines organized into 10 squads of 10 warriors. This decimal system allowed for precise coordination between units and simplified the complex logistics required to supply forces spread across multiple star systems. The Primarch's organizational genius extended beyond mere numerical arrangements. He instituted specialized roles within each company, designating specific squads for assault operations, tactical flexibility, heavy weapons support, and reconnaissance duties. This specialization allowed individual companies to operate independently when necessary, while maintaining the capability to integrate seamlessly with larger formations during major campaigns. Guilliman personally oversaw the training of company captains, ensuring they understood not just their tactical responsibilities, but also the administrative duties required to maintain their units in peak fighting condition across extended deployments. Guilliman's strategic vision for the 13th Legion encompassed far more than battlefield tactics. He understood that the Great Crusade represented humanity's attempt to reclaim its scattered domains from the darkness of Old Night, a task that required not just military conquest, but the establishment of lasting imperial rule. To this end, he developed comprehensive protocols for post-conquest governance that became standard practice throughout Ultramar and later influenced imperial policy across numerous sectors. These protocols addressed everything from the integration of local military forces into imperial structures to the establishment of supply chains that could support ongoing operations while contributing to the broader war effort. The Primarch's approach to recruitment reflected his understanding of the Legion's expanding role within the Great Crusade. Rather than simply drawing candidates from Muckrage's warrior classes, Guilliman established recruitment centers across all worlds within the Ultramar sector. This broad recruitment base provided the Legion with candidates possessing diverse skill sets and cultural backgrounds, creating a more adaptable and intellectually flexible fighting force. Potential recruits underwent extensive psychological evaluation in addition to the standard physical testing, ensuring that new Ultramarines possessed not just the physical capabilities required for enhancement, but also the mental flexibility needed for the complex challenges they would face. The training regimens Guilliman instituted for new recruits went far beyond the combat instruction typical of other legions. Prospective Ultramarines studied logistics, basic engineering, diplomatic protocols, and administrative procedures alongside weapons training and tactical exercises. This comprehensive education produced Space Marines capable of functioning effectively in roles ranging from planetary governors to supply coordinators, depending on the specific needs of their deployment. The Primarch recognized that the Great Crusade's success would ultimately depend on the Imperium's ability to govern the worlds it conquered, and he intended his legion to serve as the backbone of that governance structure. Guilliman's tactical innovations during the Great Crusade established new standards for combined arms warfare that other legions would eventually adopt. His forces pioneered the integration of Space Marine infantry with armored support, artillery coordination, and air power in ways that maximized the effectiveness of each component. Rather than viewing tanks, aircraft, and infantry as separate elements that occasionally cooperated, Guilliman developed doctrine that treated them as interconnected parts of a unified system. His battle plans routinely included detailed coordination between ground forces and fleet elements, allowing orbital bombardments to prepare the way for planetary assaults, while ensuring that naval assets remained available to support ground operations as needed. The Primarch's emphasis on rapid deployment capabilities transformed how the 13th Legion approached interstellar warfare. He standardized equipment loadouts and supply configurations to minimize the time required to transition from space travel to combat operations. Ultramarines forces could deploy from their ships and establish operational bases on hostile worlds with unprecedented speed, often beginning major offensive operations within hours of making planetfall. This capability proved decisive in numerous compliance actions, where quick strikes prevented enemy forces from organizing effective resistance or calling for reinforcements from neighboring systems. During the Monarchia compliance, Guilliman demonstrated the practical application of his tactical innovations on a massive scale. The Word-Bearer's elaborate religious ceremonies and monumental construction projects had created a world whose population viewed the Emperor as a divine figure, directly contradicting the imperial truth's secular ideology. Where other legions might have approached such a compliance through overwhelming force or prolonged siege warfare, Guilliman coordinated a precise operation that neutralized military resistance while minimizing civilian casualties. His forces struck simultaneously at key infrastructure points, communication centers, and military installations, effectively paralyzing organized resistance before it could develop. The Ultramarines' performance during the Monarchia operation showcased their superior logistics and coordination capabilities. While other legions struggled with the complex task of maintaining supply lines across hostile territory, Guilliman's forces established secure corridors that allowed continuous resupply and reinforcement. His advanced planning included detailed intelligence gathering about local geography, climate conditions, and population centers, enabling his forces to adapt quickly to unexpected developments. The operation concluded with the systematic dismantling of the world's religious infrastructure, carried out with characteristic Ultramarines' efficiency and attention to detail. Guilliman's strategic approach to the Great Crusade emphasized sustainable conquest over rapid territorial expansion. Unlike some of his brother Primarchs who focused primarily on the number of worlds brought into compliance, Guilliman concentrated on ensuring that conquered territories could contribute effectively to the broader imperial war effort. His forces established comprehensive administrative structures on each world they conquered, training local personnel to maintain imperial standards while adapting to local conditions and customs. This approach required longer initial deployments, but produced more stable and productive worlds that required minimal ongoing imperial oversight. The expansion of the 13th Legion under Guilliman's leadership resulted from both successful recruitment and the integration of forces from compliant worlds. As Ultramar expanded to encompass dozens of star systems, the Legion's recruitment base grew correspondingly, allowing it to maintain larger formations than most other legions while still meeting the Primarch's exacting standards for new candidates. By the height of the Great Crusade, the Ultramarines numbered over 250,000 battle brothers, making them the largest Space Marine Legion in existence. This numerical superiority reflected not just successful recruitment, but also lower casualty rates resulting from Guilliman's careful planning and tactical expertise. The Primarch's relationship with his brother Primarchs during the Great Crusade revealed both his diplomatic skills and his commitment to the Emperor's vision for humanity. His closest bonds developed with Sanguinius of the Blood Angels and Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists, both of whom shared his dedication to duty and systematic approach to warfare. These relationships went beyond mere professional cooperation, developing into genuine friendships based on mutual respect and shared values. Guilliman and Sanguinius frequently coordinated joint operations that combined the Blood Angels' assault capabilities with the Ultramarines' logistical expertise, achieving results that neither legion could have accomplished independently. The friendship between Guilliman and Dorn proved particularly significant for the development of Imperial military doctrine. Both Primarchs possessed analytical minds and shared an appreciation for systematic planning and preparation. Their collaboration produced standardized protocols for siege warfare, defensive operations, and the construction of fortified positions that became standard throughout the Imperial military. Regular communications between their legions facilitated the exchange of tactical innovations and lessons learned from different theaters of operation, contributing to the overall effectiveness of the Great Crusade. Guilliman's interactions with more volatile Primarchs like Angron of the World Eaters revealed fundamental philosophical differences about the nature of warfare and leadership. Where Angron viewed combat as an expression of personal rage and warrior honor, Guilliman approached it as a tool for achieving specific strategic objectives. These differences created tension during joint operations, as the World Eaters' aggressive tactics often conflicted with the Ultramarines' methodical approach to battlefield coordination. Guilliman attempted to bridge these gaps through careful diplomacy and tactical flexibility, but the fundamental incompatibility between their approaches to warfare remained a source of ongoing friction. The Primarch's relationship with Lorgar of the Word-Bearers proved particularly complex due to their opposing views on the Emperor's nature and humanity's spiritual needs. Guilliman viewed the imperial truth as a practical necessity for unifying humanity under rational governance, while Lorgar saw it as an attempt to deny humanity's fundamental need for spiritual meaning. Their debates on these subjects during the early years of the Great Crusade revealed deep philosophical divisions that would later contribute to the galaxy-spanning conflict of the Horus Heresy. Despite these differences, Guilliman maintained professional courtesy with Lorgar, recognizing that their disagreements should not interfere with their shared duty to the Emperor and the Great Crusade. Throughout his campaigns, Guilliman demonstrated an exceptional ability to adapt his legion's capabilities to meet the specific challenges of different theaters of operation. In the densely populated hive worlds of the Segmentum Solar, the Ultramarines developed specialized urban warfare techniques that minimized collateral damage while maintaining operational effectiveness. When operating in the frontier regions beyond the galactic rim, they adapted their logistics and supply protocols to function effectively in systems lacking established infrastructure. This adaptability reflected the comprehensive training Guilliman provided to his officers and the systematic approach he applied to every aspect of military operations. The systematic documentation of tactical knowledge that Guilliman had begun during his early campaigns with the 13th Legion evolved into something far more comprehensive as the Great Crusade progressed. What started as standardized after-action reports and operational procedures gradually expanded into a complete framework for space marine warfare, organization, and strategic thinking. The Codex Astartes emerged from this process not as a single moment of inspiration, but as the culmination of decades of practical experience, careful analysis, and methodical refinement of military doctrine based on the realities of interstellar warfare. Guilliman's approach to developing the Codex reflected his fundamental belief that effective military doctrine must be grounded in empirical evidence rather than theoretical speculation. Every tactical formation described in its pages had been tested in actual combat. Every organizational structure had proven its effectiveness across multiple campaigns, and every strategic principle had demonstrated its value in the crucible of war. The Primarch drew upon the collective experience of not just the Ultramarines, but also the documented practices of other legions, incorporating the most effective elements while discarding those that had proven inadequate or counterproductive. The theoretical foundation underlying Guilliman's military philosophy centered on the concept of adaptability as the supreme virtue in warfare. He recognized that no battle plan, regardless of how carefully constructed, would survive contact with enemy forces without modification. Therefore, the Codex emphasized the development of flexible tactical thinking rather than rigid adherence to predetermined formations. Space Marine commanders were trained to understand the principles behind specific tactics rather than simply memorizing procedural steps, enabling them to adapt these principles to unexpected situations while maintaining operational effectiveness. The Primarch's combined arms doctrine represented a revolutionary approach to Space Marine warfare that integrated infantry, armor, artillery, and air support into seamless tactical systems. Traditional Space Marine deployments had often relied primarily on the superior capabilities of individual Astartes warriors, with supporting elements playing secondary roles. Guilliman's innovations treated each component as an essential part of a larger whole, with infantry providing the flexibility and precision that armored units lacked, while tanks offered the firepower and protection that infantry required. Artillery and air support were not merely supplementary assets, but integral elements whose coordination with ground forces could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. The logistics principles outlined in the Codex reflected Guilliman's understanding that military operations ultimately depended on the mundane realities of supply, maintenance, and transportation. The most skilled warriors in the galaxy would fail if they lacked ammunition, fuel, or replacement equipment when needed. The Codex therefore devoted extensive sections to supply chain management, establishing standardized procedures for everything from ammunition distribution to vehicle maintenance schedules. These procedures ensured that Space Marine forces could maintain operational effectiveness across extended campaigns while minimizing the logistical burden on Imperial resources. Guilliman's organizational innovations extended far beyond the basic company structure he had established for the Ultramarines. The Codex detailed specialized formations for specific tactical situations, from rapid deployment forces designed for lightning strikes against enemy command centers to heavy assault companies equipped for prolonged siege operations. Each formation possessed clearly defined capabilities and limitations, allowing commanders to select the appropriate force composition for their specific mission requirements. The standardization of these formations across all Space Marine forces would eventually enable different chapters to coordinate their operations seamlessly, even when they had never worked together previously. The comprehensive nature of the Codex encompassed every aspect of Space Marine operations, from the individual squad level to fleet-wide strategic coordination. Squad formations received detailed analysis, with specific guidance on optimal spacing, fire coordination, and movement techniques for different terrain types and tactical situations. The document addressed the complexities of urban warfare, where tight confines and civilian populations required modified approaches to standard tactical doctrine. It provided extensive coverage of void warfare, recognizing that Space Marines must be as effective in the cramped corridors of enemy starships as they were on planetary battlefields. Planetary assault protocols represented some of the most sophisticated sections of the Codex, reflecting Guilliman's extensive experience in compliance operations across diverse world types. The document outlined systematic approaches to intelligence gathering, target identification, and force deployment that could be adapted to everything from primitive feudal worlds to highly advanced technological civilizations. These protocols emphasize the importance of understanding local conditions, political structures, and military capabilities before committing forces to combat operations. The Primarch recognized that successful planetary assaults required more than just overwhelming firepower. They demanded careful coordination between diplomatic, intelligence, and military assets to achieve lasting compliance. The post-conquest governance sections of the Codex revealed Guilliman's unique perspective on the Space Marines' role within the broader Imperial structure. While other Primarchs viewed their legions primarily as military instruments, Guilliman understood that the Great Crusade's ultimate success required the establishment of stable governance on conquered worlds. The Codex therefore included detailed procedures for transitioning from military occupation to civilian administration, guidelines for integrating local military forces into imperial structures, and protocols for establishing the infrastructure necessary to support ongoing imperial operations. Fleet operations received equally comprehensive treatment within the Codex, reflecting the critical importance of naval assets in interstellar warfare. The document outlined standardized formations for different types of naval operations, from convoy escort duties to major fleet engagements against enemy battle groups. Coordination between fleet and ground elements received particular emphasis, with detailed procedures for orbital bombardment, atmospheric insertion, and the complex logistics of supporting ground operations from space-based assets. The Codex recognized that effective interstellar warfare required seamless integration between naval and ground forces, with neither able to achieve decisive results without proper support from the other. Guilliman's vision of the Space Marines' role within the Imperium reflected his understanding of the delicate balance between military effectiveness and political stability. The Primarch recognized that Space Marine legions possessed the capability to overthrow planetary governments or even challenge the authority of the Emperor himself, as events would later prove during the Horus Heresy. The Codex therefore emphasized the importance of discipline, loyalty, and adherence to proper command structures as essential safeguards against the abuse of Space Marine power. The document stressed that Space Marines served the Imperium rather than their own interests, and that their extraordinary capabilities came with corresponding responsibilities to protect rather than exploit the populations under their care. The tactical flexibility emphasized throughout the Codex reflected Guilliman's belief that rigid doctrine would prove inadequate against the diverse threats the Imperium faced. Enemy forces ranged from primitive human tribes armed with crude weapons to sophisticated alien civilizations possessing advanced technology. The Codex provided frameworks for analyzing enemy capabilities and adapting Imperial tactics accordingly, rather than prescribing specific responses to particular threats. This approach ensured that Space Marine commanders could develop effective strategies against opponents they had never previously encountered, drawing upon established principles while maintaining the flexibility to innovate as circumstances required. Intelligence gathering and analysis received extensive coverage within the Codex, reflecting Guilliman's understanding that accurate information was as important as superior firepower in determining battle outcomes. The document outlined systematic approaches to reconnaissance, enemy assessment, and information processing that enabled commanders to make informed decisions even in rapidly changing tactical situations. These procedures emphasize the importance of multiple information sources, careful verification of intelligence reports, and continuous updating of enemy assessments as new information became available. The training regimens detailed in the Codex went far beyond basic combat instruction, encompassing the full range of skills that Space Marines would need to function effectively in their expanded role within the Imperium. The document outlined educational programs covering diplomacy, administration, technical specializations, and leadership development, alongside traditional weapons training and tactical exercises. This comprehensive approach to Space Marine development reflected Guilliman's vision of Astartes warriors as versatile instruments of imperial policy rather than simply elite soldiers. Communication protocols received detailed attention within the Codex, recognizing that effective coordination required clear, standardized procedures for information exchange between different units and command levels. The document established common terminology, reporting formats, and communication hierarchies that would enable Space Marine forces from different chapters to work together effectively even when they lacked previous joint training experience. These protocols proved essential during major campaigns where multiple chapters operated under unified command structures. The Codex addressed the psychological aspects of warfare with the same systematic approach that Guilliman applied to tactical and logistical considerations. The document recognized that maintaining morale and unit cohesion during extended campaigns required careful attention to the mental and emotional well-being of individual Space Marines. It outlined procedures for identifying and addressing combat stress, maintaining unit traditions and identity, and preserving the bonds of brotherhood that held Space Marine formations together under the most challenging circumstances. Equipment standardization represented another crucial element of the Codex, establishing common specifications for weapons, armor, vehicles, and support equipment across all Space Marine forces. This standardization simplified logistics, enabled resource sharing between different units, and ensured that replacement equipment would be compatible with existing systems regardless of its source. The document provided detailed maintenance schedules, replacement criteria, and upgrade procedures that maximized equipment reliability while minimizing resource requirements. The strategic principles outlined in the Codex emphasized the importance of understanding the broader context within which individual battles occurred. The document stressed that tactical victories meant little unless they contributed to larger strategic objectives, and that commanders must always consider the long-term implications of their operational decisions. This strategic perspective reflected Guilliman's experience in managing complex multi-world campaigns, where individual battles were components of larger efforts to bring entire sectors into Imperial compliance. The corruption that would tear the galaxy asunder began not with grand declarations of rebellion, but with carefully orchestrated deceptions that exploited the bonds of brotherhood between the Primarchs. Lorgar Aurelian, bearer of the word and master of the 17th Legion, had nursed his grievances against Guilliman and the Emperor for decades following the humiliation at Monarchia. The public censure of his legion's religious practices and the destruction of their perfect city had planted seeds of resentment that grew into something far more dangerous under the influence of powers beyond the material realm. The Shadow Crusade that would culminate in the betrayal at Calth represented the culmination of Lorgar's transformation from loyal son to architect of heresy. The word-bearer's apparent compliance with the Emperor's secular edicts following Monarchia masked a fundamental shift in their spiritual allegiances. Lorgar's pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror had revealed truths about the nature of reality that shattered his previous understanding of divinity and humanity's place in the cosmos. The Chaos Gods offered power and purpose that the Imperial truth could never provide, promising a universe where faith would triumph over reason, and where those who embraced the primordial forces would inherit dominion over creation itself. The conversion of the word-bearers proceeded in absolute secrecy, hidden beneath layers of apparent orthodoxy that deceived even their fellow Astartes. The strategic planning that preceded the assault on Calth demonstrated Lorgar's newfound understanding of warfare as a tool of spiritual transformation rather than mere conquest. The word-bearers had spent years infiltrating the Ultramarines' supply chains, communication networks, and support structures throughout the Ultramar sector. Cultists wearing the faces of loyal Imperial servants worked tirelessly to position weapons, sabotage equipment, and gather intelligence about Ultramarines' deployments and defensive preparations. This vast conspiracy operated beneath the notice of Guilliman's normally meticulous intelligence apparatus, protected by powers that could cloud minds and obscure evidence from even the most careful observers. The selection of Calth as the primary target for the word-bearer's betrayal reflected both strategic calculation and symbolic significance. The world served as one of Ultramar's most important military production centers, its vast underground manufactorums producing ammunition, vehicles, and equipment for the entire sector's defense forces. The planet's strategic location made it a crucial waypoint for Ultramarines' fleet movements, while its sophisticated orbital defense platforms provided security for the shipping lanes that connected Ultramar to the broader Imperium. More importantly, Calth represented everything that Lorgar despised about Guilliman's vision for humanity, a world where rational planning and secular governance had created prosperity without acknowledging any higher spiritual purpose. The deception that brought both legions to Calth began with fabricated intelligence reports suggesting a massive orc incursion in the Viridian system, supposedly requiring the combined strength of the Ultramarines and Word-Bearers to contain. Horus Lupercal, recently elevated to the position of War Master, provided the operational orders that directed both legions to rendezvous at Calth before proceeding to engage the alleged Xenos threat. The authenticity of these orders, bearing the War Master's personal seal and transmitted through established command channels, left no room for suspicion in Guilliman's mind. The Primarch of Ultramar viewed the joint operation as an opportunity to demonstrate the effectiveness of coordinated Legion tactics while strengthening the bonds of brotherhood that united the Emperor's sons. Guilliman's preparations for the Calth muster reflected his characteristic attention to detail and systematic approach to military operations. The Ultramarines assembled nearly half their total strength on and around the world, with over 100,000 Space Marines participating in what they believed would be a straightforward compliance operation. The 4th Company under Captain Remus Ventanis took responsibility for coordinating ground-based logistics, while the 19th Company established orbital patrol schedules to protect the assembling fleet. Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children, present as an observer, noted the impressive efficiency with which the Ultramarines organized their forces, commenting that their preparations resembled a perfectly choreographed military exercise rather than hasty mobilization for combat. The Word-Bearers' arrival at Calth proceeded according to their carefully rehearsed deception, with Lorgar himself leading a fleet that appeared to conform to standard Legion deployment protocols. The 17th Legion's ships took positions within the system that seemed tactically appropriate for a joint operation, their weapons powered down, and their crews following established procedures for friendly fleet interactions. Lorgar met with Guilliman aboard the Ultramarines' flagship Macragge's Honor, where the two Primarchs discussed operational plans for the supposed Viridian campaign with apparent collegiality. The Word-Bearer's performance during these meetings revealed no hint of the treachery he was preparing to unleash. The corruption of Calth Star began several hours before the main assault commenced, initiated by Word-Bearer's sorcerers who had spent months preparing the necessary rituals and positioning the required materials throughout the system. The stellar manipulation required precise coordination between multiple psychers working in concert, their combined will reaching across the void to touch the nuclear fires that sustained all life in the system. The initial effects appeared as minor fluctuations in solar output, easily dismissed as natural variations that posed no immediate threat to planetary operations. Only when the star began exhibiting increasingly violent behavior did Ultramarines astronomers recognize that something fundamentally wrong was occurring. The orbital bombardment that initiated the Battle of Calth struck without warning at the moment, when Ultramarines' forces were most vulnerable to surprise attack. Word-Bearers' ships that had maintained friendly positions suddenly opened fire with every weapon at their disposal, targeting orbital defense platforms, supply depots, and troop concentrations with devastating precision. The carefully planned nature of the assault became immediately apparent as Word-Bearers' gunners demonstrated intimate knowledge of Ultramarines' defensive positions, striking at weak points and critical infrastructure with accuracy that could only have resulted from extensive reconnaissance and preparation. The Campanile of Calth, the massive orbital defense station that served as the system's primary military coordination center, suffered catastrophic damage within the first minutes of the bombardment. Word-Bearers' heavy cruisers concentrated their fire on the station's reactor complex, causing secondary explosions that tore through multiple decks and killed thousands of Imperial personnel. The destruction of the Campanile eliminated the Ultramarines' ability to coordinate system-wide defensive operations, forcing individual ship captains and ground commanders to respond to the crisis based on limited local intelligence and their own tactical judgment. Captain Ventanus found himself commanding ground forces on Calth's surface as word-bearers' drop pods began raining from the sky like metallic meteors. The initial landing zones appeared random to casual observation, but Ventanus quickly recognized that the enemy had selected sites that would allow them to strike simultaneously at communication centers, ammunition depots, and the underground manufactorums that supplied the entire Ultramar sector. The word-bearers' intimate knowledge of Calth's infrastructure became increasingly apparent as their assault forces moved directly toward targets that should have been unknown to outsiders. The fighting that erupted across Calth's surface revealed fundamental differences in how the two legions approached warfare. The Ultramarines responded to the surprise attack with characteristic discipline and tactical flexibility, falling back to prepared positions while establishing new command and control networks to replace those destroyed in the initial bombardment. Their training in combined arms warfare proved invaluable as they coordinated between scattered units, using remaining vehicles and heavy weapons to establish strongpoints that could anchor defensive lines. The systematic approach that Guilliman had drilled into his legion enabled them to maintain unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness even when cut off from higher command. The word-bearers' assault tactics reflected their spiritual transformation and allegiance to powers beyond the material realm. Their attacks exhibited a ferocity and coordination that exceeded normal Space Marine capabilities, with individual squads demonstrating almost supernatural awareness of enemy positions and movements. The corruption that had consumed the 17th Legion manifested in subtle ways that initially escaped notice: weapons that fired with impossible accuracy, warriors who seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they occurred, and an overall tactical coordination that suggested some form of enhanced communication between scattered units. Guilliman's response to the betrayal demonstrated both his tactical genius and his ability to adapt rapidly to completely unexpected circumstances. The Primarch had been aboard the Crag's Honor when the bombardment began, placing him in an ideal position to coordinate the Ultramarines' naval response to the word-bearers' treachery. His first priority involved establishing secure communication links with ground forces, using the flagship's powerful transmitters to penetrate the interference created by the ongoing orbital bombardment. The Primarch's calm demeanor during the crisis provided a stabilizing influence on his subordinates, who looked to him for guidance in a situation that defied all their previous experience. The naval engagement that developed around Calth showcased the importance of crew training and ship maintenance in determining the outcome of fleet actions. The Ultramarines' systematic approach to naval operations proved superior to the word-bearers' reliance on supernatural enhancement, as properly maintained weapons systems and well-drilled gun crews achieved higher rates of fire and greater accuracy than their corrupted opponents. The Crag's Honor engaged multiple word-bearers' vessels simultaneously, its massive guns methodically destroying enemy ships while its thick armor plating absorbed return fire that would have crippled less well-protected vessels. The underground war that developed within Calth's manufactorums represented some of the most brutal fighting of the entire engagement. Word-bearers' assault teams had infiltrated the subterranean facilities through maintenance tunnels and service corridors, using their detailed knowledge of the complex's layout to strike at critical production centers and storage areas. The confined spaces and industrial machinery created a nightmarish battlefield where standard tactical formations proved useless and individual combat skills determined survival. Ultramarines' defenders found themselves fighting room by room through facilities they had thought completely secure, discovering that the enemy possessed maps and access codes that should have been impossible to obtain. The corruption of Calth's star reached critical levels as the surface battle intensified, creating environmental conditions that threatened all life on the planet, regardless of which side achieved tactical victory. Solar radiation levels increased beyond the tolerance of unprotected human life, forcing both sides to seek shelter in underground facilities or heavily shielded structures. The The star's increasingly erratic behavior created electromagnetic interference that disrupted communications and targeting systems, adding another layer of complexity to an already chaotic battle. The word-bearers had clearly planned for these conditions, as their forces moved with confidence through areas where Ultramarines units struggled with equipment failures and navigation difficulties. The psychological impact of the betrayal proved as devastating as the physical damage inflicted by word-bearers' weapons. The Ultramarines had never conceived that fellow Space Marines might turn against their own brothers without warning or provocation. The systematic nature of the deception, revealed through captured intelligence and interrogated prisoners, demonstrated that the word-bearers had been planning this treachery for years while maintaining the pretense of loyalty. This revelation shattered fundamental assumptions about trust and brotherhood that had defined relationships between the legions since the beginning of the Great Crusade. Guilliman's tactical adaptations during the battle reflected his ability to process complex information rapidly and develop effective responses to unprecedented threats. The Primarch recognized that conventional defensive strategies would prove inadequate against an enemy that possessed detailed intelligence about Ultramarines' positions and capabilities. He therefore implemented a series of tactical deceptions designed to exploit the word-bearers' overconfidence in their intelligence assets, using false radio communications and dummy positions to draw enemy forces into carefully prepared killing zones. These innovations demonstrated the intellectual flexibility that had made Guilliman one of the Emperor's most valued military commanders. The resilience displayed by individual Ultramarines units during the battle provided evidence of the superior training and indoctrination that Guilliman had implemented throughout his legion. Cut off from higher command and facing overwhelming odds, squad leaders and individual Space Marines continued fighting with determination that impressed even their enemies. The systematic approach to military education that the Primarch had established enabled his warriors to adapt their tactics to unexpected situations while maintaining unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness. This adaptability proved crucial as the battle evolved from a conventional engagement into a desperate struggle for survival. The revelation that the word-bearers possessed supernatural allies became apparent as the battle progressed and Ultramarines' forces encountered phenomena that defied rational explanation. Enemy psychers demonstrated abilities that exceeded anything documented in Imperial records, manipulating reality itself to support their assault operations. The appearance of entities that bore no resemblance to any known Xeno species suggested that the word-bearers had allied themselves with forces from beyond the material realm. These revelations forced Guilliman to confront the possibility that the galaxy contained threats far more dangerous than simple rebellion or alien invasion. The aftermath of the initial assault left Calth transformed from a prosperous manufacturing world into a battlefield where survival took precedence over all other considerations. The planet's surface had become largely uninhabitable due to radiation from the corrupted star, forcing survivors to retreat into underground facilities that had never been designed for long-term habitation. The destruction of orbital infrastructure eliminated regular supply shipments, creating resource shortages that affected both sides equally. The battle evolved from a conventional military engagement into a war of attrition where logistics and endurance would determine the ultimate victor. The surface devastation at Calth marked only the beginning of a conflict that would rage for years beneath the planet's scarred crust. As radiation levels from the corrupted star made the upper atmosphere lethal to unprotected human life, both Ultramarines and word-bearers' forces retreated into the vast subterranean networks that honeycombed the world's interior. These underground complexes, originally excavated to house manufacturing facilities and storage depots, became the theater for a grinding war of attrition that tested the endurance and adaptability of both legions in ways that conventional warfare never could. The Calth Underground represented one of the most extensive artificial cave systems in the galaxy, with tunnels and chambers stretching for thousands of kilometers beneath the planet's surface. Generations of mining and industrial expansion had created a three-dimensional maze of interconnected passages, manufacturing halls, and storage caverns that defied easy mapping or control. The word-bearers' infiltration efforts had provided them with detailed charts of many sections, but the sheer scale of the underground meant that vast areas remained unknown to both sides. Navigation became a constant challenge as standard positioning equipment failed in the electromagnetically chaotic environment created by the dying star above. Captain Remus Ventanis assumed command of the largest Ultramarines force, trapped underground when communications with the surface became impossible. His fourth company had been conducting routine inspections of ammunition storage facilities when the orbital bombardment began, placing them in an ideal position to secure critical supplies and establish defensive positions in the tunnel networks. Ventanis quickly recognized that conventional tactical doctrine would require significant modification for the unique challenges of subterranean warfare, where line of sight rarely extended beyond a few dozen meters, and the constant threat of structural collapse limited the use of heavy weapons. The word-bearers' underground assault forces operated with a coordination that suggested supernatural guidance, moving through the tunnel networks with confidence that indicated knowledge beyond what their captured maps should have provided. Individual squads demonstrated an uncanny ability to locate Ultramarines' positions through solid rock walls, striking at weak points in defensive lines with precision that defied explanation. The corruption that had consumed the 17th Legion manifested more obviously in the confined underground environment, where their enhanced senses and unnatural coordination provided significant tactical advantages over their loyalist opponents. Ventanis adapted his command structure to accommodate the realities of underground warfare, establishing a network of independent strongpoints that could support each other while maintaining autonomous defensive capabilities. Each position was built around a critical resource or strategic location, ammunition depots, water purification systems, or major tunnel junctions that controlled access to large sections of the underground. The Ultramarines' systematic approach to fortification proved invaluable as they transformed industrial facilities into defensive positions, using manufacturing equipment and stored materials to create barriers and firing positions that maximized their defensive advantages. The environmental hazards of the underground war proved as dangerous as enemy action for both sides. The planet's geological instability, exacerbated by the stellar corruption above, created constant risks of tunnel collapses and structural failures that could trap entire squads in sealed chambers. Water systems designed for industrial use rather than human consumption required careful monitoring and treatment to remain potable, while air circulation systems struggled to maintain breathable atmosphere in spaces never intended for long-term habitation. Both sides found themselves fighting not just each other, but the hostile environment that threatened to claim victims regardless of their allegiance. The discovery of demonic entities within the deepest sections of the underground complex revealed the true extent of word-bearers' corruption and their alliance with powers from the warp. These creatures bore no resemblance to any Xeno species documented in Imperial records, their forms shifting and changing in ways that defied physical laws. Their presence created areas of reality distortion, where standard weapons proved ineffective, and where the very act of observation could drive unprotected humans to madness. The Ultramarines found themselves fighting an enemy that violated every principle of rational warfare, forcing them to develop new tactics for combating threats that should not have been able to exist. Guilliman's isolation from the underground fighting created one of the most challenging command situations of his career. The Primarch remained aboard the Crag's honor, coordinating the naval battle that continued to rage in orbit around Calth, but his ability to influence the subterranean campaign was severely limited by communication difficulties and the unique nature of underground warfare. Standard orbital support proved useless in the confined tunnel networks, while the electromagnetic interference from the corrupted star made reliable communication with ground forces nearly impossible. For the first time since assuming command of the 13th Legion, Guilliman found himself forced to rely entirely on the training and initiative of his subordinate commanders. the resource management challenges of the underground war forced both sides to adapt their operational priorities in fundamental ways. Ammunition conservation became critical as resupply proved impossible, leading to increased emphasis on melee combat and the improvised use of industrial equipment as weapons. Water and food supplies required careful rationing and protection, as control of these resources could determine the outcome of entire sectors of the underground battlefield. The Ultramarines' superior logistics training provided them with significant advantages in managing these challenges, as their systematic approach to resource allocation enabled them to maintain fighting effectiveness longer than their word-bearers' opponents. The psychological warfare tactics employed by the word-bearers in the underground environment exploited the claustrophobic conditions and isolation from the surface world. Corrupted Vox transmissions carried messages designed to demoralize Ultramarines' defenders, while the strategic placement of mutilated corpses and blasphemous symbols created constant reminders of their enemies' supernatural allies. The word-bearers had learned to use the acoustic properties of the tunnel networks to their advantage, creating sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, and using coordinated noise to mask the movement of assault forces. Captain Ventanus demonstrated exceptional leadership during the underground campaign, maintaining unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness despite the unprecedented challenges his forces faced. His tactical innovations included the development of specialized tunnel fighting techniques that maximized the Ultramarines' advantages in discipline and coordination, while minimizing their exposure to word-bearers' supernatural abilities. The captain established a comprehensive intelligence network that tracked enemy movements throughout the accessible sections of the underground, using this information to coordinate ambushes and defensive preparations that inflicted significant casualties on word-bearers' assault forces. The industrial infrastructure of Calth's underground provided both opportunities and obstacles for military operations. Manufacturing equipment could be converted into improvised weapons and defensive barriers, while the complex's power systems offered the possibility of creating devastating traps for unwary enemies. However, the same infrastructure created vulnerabilities that both sides sought to exploit, as the destruction of key systems could render entire sections of the underground uninhabitable. The word-bearers' detailed knowledge of the facility layouts enabled them to target critical systems with precision, forcing Ultramarines' defenders to constantly adapt their positions as their environment became increasingly hostile. The emergence of Ultramarines survivors from previously unknown sections of the underground complex provided Ventanus with additional forces and intelligence about word-bearers' dispositions. These scattered units had been conducting their own independent campaigns against the invaders, developing local knowledge and tactical innovations that proved valuable when integrated into the larger defensive effort. The systematic debriefing of these survivors revealed the extent of word-bearers' infiltration and the sophisticated nature of their pre-assault preparations, information that helped explain their initial tactical successes. The duration of the underground war stretched far beyond what either side had anticipated, evolving from a tactical engagement into a strategic campaign that would influence the broader course of the Horus Heresy. As months passed without decisive resolution, both sides found themselves adapting to a form of warfare that bore little resemblance to the mobile campaigns of the Great Crusade. The confined environment and limited resources created conditions more similar to ancient siege warfare than the rapid maneuver operations that had characterized Space Marine tactics for decades. Meanwhile, the isolation of Ultramar from the broader Imperium created unprecedented challenges for Guilliman's strategic planning. The Ruin Storm, a massive warp disturbance that separated the 500 worlds from Terra, eliminated reliable communication with the Emperor and made interstellar travel extremely hazardous. Reports from refugee ships and scattered Imperial forces painted a picture of galaxy-wide rebellion that suggested the word-bearers' betrayal at Calth was part of a much larger conspiracy. The fragmented intelligence available to Guilliman indicated that multiple legions had turned against the Emperor, though the full scope of the treachery remained unclear. The communications blackout that followed the Ruinstorm's formation left Guilliman with no reliable information about the Emperor's status or the situation on Terra. Fragmentary reports suggested that the Imperial Palace was under siege, while other accounts claimed that the Emperor had been killed in the initial stages of the rebellion. The contradictory nature of these reports, combined with the obvious unreliability of sources that had traveled through warp storms, made it impossible to determine which accounts contained accurate information. Guilliman found himself forced to make strategic decisions based on incomplete intelligence and worst-case assumptions about the Imperium's survival. The Primarch's analysis of the strategic situation led him to conclude that the Imperium as he had known it might no longer exist. If the reports of the Emperor's death proved accurate, the carefully constructed political and military structures that had united humanity under a single banner would collapse into competing factions and regional powers. The Space Marine legions that remained loyal would find themselves fighting not just against their corrupted brothers, but also against the centrifugal forces that would tear the Imperium apart in the absence of central authority. Guilliman recognized that some form of alternative governance structure would be necessary to preserve what remained of human civilization. The concept of Imperium Secundus emerged from Guilliman's systematic analysis of the political and military realities facing the loyalist forces trapped beyond the Ruinstorm. If Terra had fallen and the Emperor was dead, then the surviving loyal Primarchs and their forces would need to establish new centers of authority to continue the fight against the traitors. Ultramar possessed the industrial capacity, defensive positions, and administrative infrastructure necessary to serve as the foundation for such an alternative Imperium. The 500 worlds could provide the resources and population base needed to sustain military operations while serving as a refuge for loyalist forces from other regions. The decision to proclaim Imperium Secundus represented one of the most controversial choices of Guilliman's career, as it required him to act without explicit authorization from the Emperor or the established imperial hierarchy. The Primarch understood that his actions could be interpreted as treasonous if the Emperor survived and the original Imperium remained intact. However, his analysis of the available information suggested that inaction would result in the complete collapse of human civilization in the galactic East, leaving the traitor forces free to consolidate their conquests without opposition. The establishment of Imperium Secundus offered the only realistic possibility of organizing effective resistance against the rebellion. The arrival of Sanguinius and the Blood Angels at Ma Crag provided Guilliman with both military reinforcement and political legitimacy for his plans. The Angels' presence offered proof that other loyal Primarchs had survived the initial stages of the rebellion, while his reputation for nobility and honor provided moral authority that Guilliman's more practical reputation could not match. The reunion between the two Primarchs revealed the full extent of the galaxy-wide catastrophe, as Sanguinius brought detailed intelligence about the rebellion's scope and the systematic nature of the traitors' preparations. The formation of the triumvirate gained additional legitimacy with the eventual arrival of Lionel Johnson and elements of the First Legion. The Lion's reputation as a master strategist and his legion's proven combat effectiveness provided the new Imperium with additional military capability, while his presence completed a leadership structure that represented three of the most respected loyal Primarchs. However, the political dynamics between the three brothers proved complex, as each brought different perspectives on governance, military strategy, and the appropriate response to the rebellion. The establishment of Imperium Secundus required the creation of entirely new governmental structures that could function independently of Terra while maintaining the essential elements of imperial authority. Guilliman's administrative expertise proved invaluable in designing systems that could coordinate military operations across multiple star systems while providing civilian governance for populations displaced by the rebellion. The new Imperium needed to balance military necessity with the maintenance of civil order, ensuring that resources were allocated efficiently while preserving the social structures that distinguished human civilization from barbarism. The moral complexities of Imperium Secundus created ongoing tensions within the triumvirate and their subordinate commanders. Many officers questioned the legitimacy of establishing an alternative Imperium without explicit authorization from the Emperor, while others argued that circumstances demanded immediate action regardless of political niceties. The debate over whether Imperium Secundus represented necessary adaptation to changed circumstances or dangerous precedent for future rebellions would continue throughout its existence, influencing every major policy decision and strategic choice. The desperate race to reach Terra began the moment reliable communications penetrated the ruined storm and confirmed Guilliman's worst fears about the siege of the Imperial Palace. The fragmentary reports that reached Ultramar painted a picture of unprecedented devastation, with Horus Lupercal's traitor forces having breached the outer defenses and pushed deep into the palace complex itself. The Emperor's psychic beacon, that guiding light which had enabled navigation through the warp for millennia, flickered with an inconsistency that suggested either severe damage to the Golden Throne or catastrophic injury to the Master of Mankind himself. Guilliman immediately began mobilizing every available ship and warrior for the journey to Terra, knowing that each passing hour might mean the difference between arriving in time to aid the defense or finding only ruins where the heart of the Imperium once stood. The strategic calculations that had guided Horus's rebellion became apparent as Guilliman attempted to organize the relief force. The War Master had deliberately positioned his most trusted lieutenants to intercept and delay any loyalist reinforcements attempting to reach Terra, creating a gauntlet of traitor forces that stretched across multiple sectors between Ultramar and the Sol system. The Alpha Legion had seeded the route with false intelligence and sabotage operations, designed to misdirect loyalist fleets into ambushes or force them to take longer, more circuitous paths to their destination. Word-bearer fleets, operating from hidden bases established during their years of apparent compliance, emerged to harass supply convoys and strike at isolated squadrons attempting to navigate the treacherous currents of the warp. The Iron Warriors had constructed fortress worlds at strategic choke points along the most direct routes to Terra, turning what should have been simple transit systems into heavily defended obstacles that required full-scale assault operations to overcome. Perdurabo's methodical genius had created killing fields in space, where overlapping defensive positions could concentrate devastating firepower against any fleet attempting to force passage. These fortifications had been under construction for years, disguised as routine defensive improvements or justified by fabricated intelligence about Xeno's threats in the region. The scope of the deception revealed the careful planning that had preceded the rebellion, with every apparent act of loyalty serving to position traitor forces for maximum strategic advantage. Guilliman's fleet encountered the first of these obstacles at the Thramas sector, where Iron Warriors' fortifications had turned a previously routine way station into a fortress system capable of interdicting all traffic between Ultramar and the galactic core. The battle for Thramas demonstrated both the effectiveness of Perdurabo's defensive doctrine and the limitations of attempting to breach prepared positions with insufficient time for proper siege preparations. The Ultramarines possessed superior numbers and tactical flexibility, but the Iron Warriors had spent months preparing overlapping fields of fire and carefully positioned minefields that channeled attacking fleets into predetermined killing zones. The orbital fortresses surrounding Thramas prime bristled with weapon batteries that could engage multiple targets simultaneously, their massive void shields capable of absorbing punishment that would have destroyed conventional warships. The Iron Warriors had learned from their experiences during the Great Crusade, incorporating lessons from every siege they had conducted into defensive systems that maximized their advantages while minimizing opportunities for enemy exploitation. Gun platforms positioned throughout the system created crossfire patterns that made direct assault prohibitively costly, while the fortresses themselves were built with overlapping defensive zones that ensured no single position could be isolated and destroyed without first eliminating its supporting installations. The The time required to reduce the Thrama's fortifications cost Guilliman precious weeks that he could not afford to lose. Each day spent in siege operations was another day that the Emperor might be fighting for his life against overwhelming odds, another opportunity for Horus to consolidate his victory and establish unassailable control over the Imperium's heart. The Primarch's frustration grew as his forces methodically dismantled the Iron Warriors' defenses, knowing that their careful, systematic approach was exactly what the enemy had hoped to achieve through their strategic positioning. The siege of Thramas became a race against time, with Ultramarines' assault forces pushing themselves beyond normal operational limits in their desperate attempt to break through before it was too late. Similar delays occurred at dozens of other systems along the route to Terra, each one costing additional time that Guilliman's relief force could not spare. The pattern became clear as intelligence reports revealed the systematic nature of the obstacles. Every major transit route had been blocked or heavily fortified, forcing loyalist fleets to choose between costly frontal assaults and time-consuming detours through less secure systems. The Alpha Legion's sabotage operations compounded these delays, as supply convoys arrived with contaminated fuel supplies or critical navigation equipment that failed at crucial moments. The cumulative effect of these disruptions added months to what should have been a journey of weeks. The Word-Bearers' harassment operations targeted not just the military aspects of the relief effort, but also the morale and cohesion of the Loyalist forces. Their attacks focused on supply ships carrying medical supplies and replacement equipment, creating shortages that forced difficult decisions about resource allocation and operational priorities. Chaplains and other spiritual advisors found themselves dealing with questions about the Emperor's nature and the righteousness of the imperial cause that they had never encountered before. The corruption that had consumed the 17th Legion manifested in their ability to sow doubt and discord even among forces that never directly engaged them in combat. The news that reached Guilliman's fleet during the final approach to the Sol system confirmed his worst fears about the timing of their arrival. The siege had ended, Horus was dead, but the Emperor had been mortally wounded in their final confrontation and now lay entombed within the Golden Throne, sustained only by the constant sacrifice of thousands of psychers whose life force fed the arcane mechanisms keeping him alive. The Imperial Palace bore the scars of the most devastating assault in human history, with entire sections reduced to rubble, and the carefully maintained gardens and courtyards transformed into crater-filled wastelands where nothing would grow for centuries to come. The sight that greeted the Ultramarines as their ships entered orbit around Terra defied the imagination of warriors who had witnessed the destruction of entire worlds during the Great Crusade. The planet's surface showed the aftermath of orbital bombardments that had carved new mountain ranges from the bedrock, while the atmospheric composition had been altered by the massive fires that had consumed entire continents. The Imperial Palace itself remained standing, but its proud spires and magnificent architecture bore the marks of weapons that had been designed to crack open fortress worlds. Entire districts within the palace complex had been obliterated, leaving gaps in the structure that would never be properly rebuilt. Guilliman's first meeting with the surviving defenders of Terra took place in the ruins of what had once been the Hall of Triumph, where the Emperor had received the homage of conquered worlds during the height of the Great Crusade. The marble columns that had supported the magnificent dome lay shattered across floors, stained with the blood of heroes, whose names would be remembered for millennia. Rogel Dorn, his armor bearing the scars of desperate fighting and his face marked by grief that seemed to age him beyond his years, provided the detailed account of the siege's final stages that confirmed the worst of Guilliman's fears about the Imperium's future. The Emperor's condition proved even worse than the fragmentary reports had suggested. The Master of Mankind's physical form had been so severely damaged in his confrontation with Horus that only the most advanced life support systems could maintain the spark of consciousness within his broken body. The Golden Throne, originally designed as a psychic amplifier for the Emperor's work on the Webway project, had been hastily converted into a life support system that required constant maintenance and the daily sacrifice of thousands of psychers to function properly. The magnificent being who had united humanity under a single banner now existed as little more than a psychic echo of his former self, sustained by technology that few understood and fewer still could maintain. The political implications of the emperor's condition created challenges that no amount of military planning had anticipated. The carefully balanced power structures that had maintained imperial unity depended on the emperor's active participation in governance and his ability to resolve disputes between competing factions within the imperial hierarchy. Without his guiding presence, the various institutions of imperial government began to fragment along factional lines, with different groups claiming authority based on their interpretation of the emperor's previous instructions or their proximity to the Golden Throne during the siege's final stages. The immediate aftermath of the siege revealed the extent of the damage that the rebellion had inflicted on the Imperium's military and administrative capabilities. Entire Space Marine legions had turned traitor, taking with them not just their warriors, but also their fleets, equipment, and the industrial capacity of the worlds that supported them. The Mechanicum had suffered its own schism, with Forge worlds choosing sides based on theological disputes about the nature of knowledge and the proper relationship between human and machine intelligence. The Imperial army had been devastated by the rebellion, with many regiments destroyed in the initial fighting, while others found themselves stranded on distant worlds without supply lines or clear command authority. Guilliman's role in stabilizing the post-siege Imperium began with his systematic assessment of the surviving loyalist forces and their immediate needs. The Ultramarines' intact supply chains and manufacturing capacity made them invaluable for providing the resources necessary to begin reconstruction efforts, while their organizational expertise enabled them to coordinate relief efforts across multiple sectors simultaneously. The Primarch established supply depots throughout the Sol system, ensuring that the surviving defenders had access to food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment, while longer-term reconstruction plans were developed and implemented. The grief that Guilliman felt upon seeing his father's condition manifested not in emotional displays, but in a grim determination to preserve what remained of the Emperor's vision for humanity. The Primarch spent hours in the Golden Throne Chamber, studying the arcane mechanisms that sustained the Emperor's life, while consulting with the Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests responsible for their maintenance. His analytical mind sought to understand every aspect of the system, knowing that the Imperium's survival might depend on maintaining these devices for centuries or millennia to come. The responsibility of preserving his father's legacy weighed heavily on Guilliman's shoulders, adding personal anguish to the already overwhelming challenges of post-war reconstruction. The strategic situation facing the Loyalist forces in the immediate aftermath of the siege presented challenges that required entirely new approaches to military planning and resource allocation. The traitor legions had not been destroyed in their defeat, but had retreated to strongholds throughout the galaxy, taking with them the knowledge and equipment necessary to continue their rebellion indefinitely. The Chaos God's influence had been revealed as the true power behind the rebellion, introducing supernatural elements into military calculations that defied conventional strategic analysis. The warp itself had become more turbulent and dangerous, making interstellar travel and communication more difficult while providing the traitors with allies and resources from beyond the material realm. The Great Scouring began as a series of uncoordinated pursuit operations launched by individual Loyalist commanders seeking to prevent traitor forces from establishing secure bases in their retreat. Guilliman recognized that these scattered efforts would prove inadequate against enemies who possessed detailed knowledge of Imperial military doctrine and access to resources that conventional intelligence could not predict or counter. The systematic approach that had characterized his campaigns during the Great Crusade would be essential for the much more complex task of hunting down and destroying enemies who had once been brothers, and who retained all the tactical knowledge and strategic understanding of loyal Space Marines. The Primarch's analysis of the strategic situation revealed that the Great Scouring would require a fundamentally different approach to warfare than the compliance operations that had defined the Great Crusade. The enemy forces were not primitive human societies or alien civilizations that could be brought into imperial compliance through overwhelming force and superior technology. The traitor legions possessed equivalent equipment and training to their loyalist counterparts, while their supernatural allies provided capabilities that imperial forces had never previously encountered. Victory would require not just military superiority, but also the development of new tactics and technologies specifically designed to counter chaos-enhanced opponents. The campaign against the Iron Warriors became one of the first major operations of the Great Scouring, as Guilliman recognized that Perdurabo's legion posed a particular threat due to their expertise in fortification and siege warfare. The 4th Legion had established fortress worlds throughout the Eye of Terror's periphery, creating strongholds that could serve as bases for future raids against Imperial territory, while providing secure locations for the construction of new warships and equipment. The systematic reduction of these fortifications required the development of new siege techniques that could overcome defenses enhanced by demonic allies and powered by the raw energy of chaos itself. The Iron Warriors' defensive positions incorporated elements that defied conventional military analysis, with weapon systems that drew power directly from the warp and fortification materials that seemed to repair themselves when damaged. The Traitor Legion's alliance with Chaos had provided them with construction techniques and architectural knowledge that created structures capable of existing partially within the warp while maintaining physical presence in real space. These hybrid fortifications presented unprecedented challenges for Imperial siege engineers, requiring the development of specialized equipment and tactics that could function effectively against targets that violated the fundamental laws of physics. Guilliman's approach to the Iron Warriors campaign emphasized the systematic elimination of their supply networks and industrial capacity rather than direct assault on their primary fortifications. The Ultramarines identified the asteroid mining operations and slave labor camps that provided raw materials for the Traitor Legion's construction projects, targeting these facilities with precision strikes that disrupted their ability to maintain and expand their defensive positions. This strategy required patience and careful coordination between multiple task forces operating across vast distances, but it proved more effective than costly frontal assaults against positions that had been specifically designed to repel such attacks. The Word-Bearers presented a different type of challenge during the Great Scouring, as their corruption had transformed them into something that bore little resemblance to the Space Marines they had once been. Lorgar's Legion had embraced their alliance with the Chaos Gods completely, becoming willing servants of powers that sought not just military victory, but the complete corruption of human civilization. Their operations focused on spreading chaos cults and demonic incursions throughout Imperial space, creating threats that could not be countered through conventional military means alone. The fight against the Word-Bearers required the development of new doctrines for combating supernatural enemies while protecting Imperial forces from the corrupting influence of chaos itself. The campaigns against the 17th Legion revealed the full extent of the changes that chaos worship had wrought within their ranks. Individual Word-Bearers demonstrated abilities that exceeded normal Space Marine capabilities, while their coordination suggested forms of communication that transcended physical limitations. Their weapons and equipment had been modified with demonic enhancements that made them more effective while creating unpredictable side effects that could turn victories into disasters without warning. The Loyalist forces found themselves fighting an enemy that violated every assumption about Space Marine capabilities and limitations, requiring constant adaptation of tactics and equipment to counter new threats. The pursuit of the Word-Bearers through the galactic void led Guilliman into encounters that would forever alter his understanding of the threats facing humanity. The 17th Legion's retreat from their defeat at Terra had not been the desperate flight of broken forces, but a calculated withdrawal to positions where their demonic allies could provide maximum support. Fulgrim's participation in these campaigns came as a shock to many Loyalist commanders who had believed the Emperor's children Primarch dead following the massacre at Istvan. The Phoenician's transformation into something that bore only superficial resemblance to his former self became apparent during the first engagement between Ultramarines and Emperor's children forces in the Lair system. The corruption that had consumed Fulgrim manifested in ways that defied medical understanding, his once perfect features now bearing an otherworldly beauty that caused physical pain to observe directly. His movements possessed a fluid grace that seemed to exist outside normal temporal constraints, allowing him to react to attacks before they were fully initiated, while striking with precision that exceeded even Primarch capabilities. The demon prince that Fulgrim had become retained all his tactical knowledge and strategic understanding, while gaining access to powers that originated from dimensions beyond human comprehension. His presence on the battlefield created zones of reality distortion, where the fundamental laws of physics became unreliable, and where mortal minds struggled to process sensory input that contradicted their basic understanding of existence. The anatheme blade that Fulgrim carried into battle against his brother represented one of the most insidious weapons ever created by the powers of chaos. Forged from materials that existed simultaneously in real space and the warp, the sword possessed properties that allowed it to wound beings who should have been immune to conventional weapons. The blade's edge maintained perfect sharpness regardless of use, cutting through ceramite armor and enhanced bone with equal ease while leaving wounds that refused to heal through normal biological processes. More dangerous than its physical properties was the weapon's ability to inject spiritual poison into its victims, corruption that attacked not just the body, but the soul itself. The duel between Guilliman and Fulgrim took place aboard the battle barge Macraga's Honor during a boarding action that had seen Emperor's children assault troops teleport directly into the ship's command sections. The confined spaces of the vessel's corridors provided little room for maneuver, forcing both Primarchs to rely on their personal combat skills rather than tactical coordination with their supporting forces. Fulgrim's enhanced speed and supernatural reflexes initially gave him significant advantages in the close quarters environment, his movements creating afterimages that confused Guilliman's targeting, while his attacks came from angles that seemed geometrically impossible. Guilliman's response to his brother's transformation demonstrated the analytical approach that characterized all his military decisions. Rather than allowing emotion to cloud his judgment, the Ultramarines Primarch studied Fulgrim's attack patterns and movement capabilities, identifying weaknesses in his seemingly perfect technique. The Demon Prince's enhanced abilities came with corresponding limitations, as his supernatural speed required brief moments of stillness to maintain accuracy, while his reality warping presence created interference that affected his own sensory capabilities. These observations allowed Guilliman to predict and counter attacks that would have been impossible to defend against through conventional means. The moment when the anatheme blade found its mark came during a complex exchange where both Primarchs had committed to simultaneous attacks that left them unable to withdraw or adjust their positions. Fulgrim's thrust penetrated the joint between Guilliman's breastplate and shoulder guard, the demon weapon sliding between enhanced ribs to puncture one of his primary hearts. The physical wound itself was not immediately life-threatening, as Primarch physiology included redundant organs and enhanced healing capabilities that could compensate for such injuries. However, the spiritual poison that flowed from the blade into Guilliman's bloodstream began its insidious work immediately, attacking the very essence of his being in ways that conventional medical treatment could not address. The anatheme's corruption manifested as a slow-acting toxin that attacked Guilliman's enhanced metabolism and regenerative capabilities, turning his own biological advantages against him. The poison interfered with his body's ability to process nutrients and eliminate waste products, while simultaneously disrupting the neural pathways that controlled his enhanced reflexes and cognitive functions. Most insidiously, the weapon's spiritual component began corrupting his connection to the warp, the psychic resonance that all Primarchs possessed as fragments of the Emperor's own essence. This corruption created feedback loops that amplified the physical symptoms, while making him increasingly vulnerable to further chaos influence. The immediate aftermath of the wounding saw Guilliman's condition deteriorate rapidly despite the best efforts of the Ultramarines apothecaries. His enhanced healing factor, normally capable of repairing even severe injuries within hours, seemed unable to address the wound left by the anatheme blade. The puncture site refused to close properly, continuing to weep a mixture of blood and an unidentifiable substance that caused severe chemical burns to any unprotected skin it contacted. Worse still, the poison appeared to be spreading through his circulatory system, causing systematic organ failures that defied all conventional medical understanding. Chief Apothecary Vaden Abbas took personal charge of Guilliman's treatment, assembling a team that included the most skilled medical personnel available within the Ultramarines Legion and representatives from every major branch of Imperial medical science. The apothecary's initial attempts to treat the wound followed established protocols for dealing with severe injuries to Astartes' physiology, but their standard techniques proved completely ineffective against the anatheme's spiritual poison. Surgical intervention to remove contaminated tissue only seemed to spread the corruption to previously healthy areas, while attempts to neutralize the toxin through chemical means resulted in violent reactions that caused additional damage to the Primarch's already compromised systems. The involvement of tech priests from the Adeptus Mechanicus brought additional expertise and technological resources to bear on the problem, but their mechanical approach to healing proved equally inadequate against a weapon that attacked the soul as much as the body. The Mechanicus representatives attempted to replace damaged organs with cybernetic alternatives, but the spiritual corruption prevented proper integration between organic and mechanical components. Their scanning equipment detected anomalous energy patterns within Guilliman's body that defied analysis, readings that suggested the presence of forces that existed outside the normal electromagnetic spectrum and could not be measured by conventional instruments. As weeks passed without improvement in Guilliman's condition, the medical team began exploring increasingly desperate treatment options. Experimental drugs derived from Xeno's biology were tested and rejected when they proved either ineffective or actively harmful to Primarch physiology. Attempts to use psychic healing techniques were abandoned when the psychers involved reported that Guilliman's spiritual essence appeared to be partially disconnected from his physical form, making it impossible to establish the psychic rapport necessary for such treatments. The corruption seemed to create a barrier that prevented both technological and biological healing methods from addressing the fundamental damage caused by the anatheme blade. The construction of the stasis field that would preserve Guilliman for the next 10 millennia began as a last resort when all other treatment options had been exhausted. The technology required for such a project drew upon the most advanced scientific knowledge available to the Imperium, combining elements of temporal manipulation, biological preservation, and psychic shielding into a single complex system. The stasis field would effectively stop time within a localized area, preventing the progression of the spiritual poison while maintaining Guilliman's life functions at their current level. This approach could not cure the corruption, but it offered the possibility of preserving him until a solution could be found. The selection of Muck Crag as the site for Guilliman's preservation reflected both practical and symbolic considerations. The world served as the spiritual heart of the Ultramarines Legion and the administrative center of the 500 worlds, making it the most secure location available for such a critical installation. The existing infrastructure on Muck Crag included the technological resources necessary to construct and maintain the stasis system, while the planet's symbolic importance would ensure that the preservation site received the protection and reverence it deserved. The decision to build the shrine within the Fortress of Hera, the massive fortress monastery that served as the Ultramarines' primary base, provided additional security while creating a focal point for the Legion's spiritual identity. The Shrine of Guilliman took shape over several months as the finest architects and engineers within Ultramar worked to create a structure worthy of housing their Primarch's preserved form. The chamber itself was carved from a single massive block of marble quarried from Muck Crag's northern mountains, its walls polished to mirror smoothness and inscribed with scenes depicting Guilliman's greatest victories and achievements. The stasis field generators were integrated seamlessly into the shrine's architecture, their technological components hidden behind decorative elements that maintain the chamber's aesthetic unity while providing easy access for maintenance personnel. The throne upon which Guilliman was placed bore symbolic significance that resonated throughout Ultramar and beyond. Crafted from the same marble as the chamber walls and inlaid with precious metals and gems from across the 500 worlds, the throne represented the unity of Ultramar under Guilliman's rule, while serving as a tangible reminder of his continuing presence among his people. The Primarch's placement upon the throne, dressed in his finest ceremonial armor and surrounded by the symbols of his achievements, created a powerful visual statement about the temporary nature of his condition and the expectation of his eventual return to active leadership. The activation of the stasis field marked the beginning of a vigil that would continue for 10,000 years. The temporal distortion created by the field made the chamber exist slightly outside normal time, creating an environment where seconds passed like hours while the outside world aged normally. Visitors to the shrine reported an overwhelming sense of presence when standing before the preserved Primarch, as if Guilliman remained aware of their presence despite his suspended state. The stasis field's effects extended beyond mere temporal manipulation, creating a zone of stability that seemed to resist the corrupting influence of chaos, while providing a focal point for the psychic faith of millions of Imperial citizens. The pilgrimage tradition that developed around the Shrine of Guilliman began within weeks of the stasis field's activation, as Ultramarines from across the galaxy sought to pay their respects to their Gene Father. These initial visits were primarily military in nature, with company captains and chapter masters seeking guidance through meditation before the preserved Primarch's form. However, the practice quickly expanded to include civilian populations from throughout Ultramar, who viewed Guilliman as not just a military leader, but as the architect of the prosperity and security they enjoyed under Imperial rule. The shrine became a destination for those seeking inspiration, guidance, or simply the reassurance that their Primarch continued to watch over them. The myths and legends that grew around the sleeping Primarch reflected the deep psychological need for hope that characterized human civilization during the Dark Millennia following the Horus Heresy. Stories circulated throughout Ultramar and beyond about signs that Guilliman remained aware of events in the outside world, with visitors claiming to have witnessed subtle changes in his expression or posture that suggested consciousness within his preserved state. These accounts, while lacking empirical verification, provided comfort to populations struggling with the constant threats that faced the Imperium during its long decline from the heights of the Great Crusade. The prophecies concerning Guilliman's return emerged from a combination of ancient texts, psyker visions, and the collective hopes of billions of Imperial citizens. The most widely accepted prophecy spoke of a time when the Imperium would face its darkest hour, when the forces of chaos would threaten to overwhelm humanity's defenses and extinguish the light of civilization forever. This moment of ultimate peril, the prophecy claimed, Guilliman would awaken from his long sleep to lead humanity's final victory against the darkness. The specific details of these prophecies varied between different versions and interpretations, but the central theme remained consistent across all variations. The role of the Ultramarines in maintaining and protecting the shrine became one of their most sacred duties, with entire companies dedicated to serving as guardians of their Primarch's resting place. These warriors underwent specialized training that combined traditional military skills with the knowledge necessary to maintain the complex technological systems that sustain the stasis field. The position of Shrine Guardian was considered one of the highest honors available within the chapter, reserved for veterans who had demonstrated exceptional loyalty and competence throughout their service careers. The Guardians maintained a constant vigil, ensuring that the shrine remained secure while providing guidance to the thousands of pilgrims who visited each year. The technological challenges of maintaining the stasis field over such an extended period required continuous innovation and adaptation as the millennia passed. The original systems designed during the 31st millennium gradually became obsolete as the Imperium's technological capabilities declined, and the knowledge necessary for their maintenance was lost or corrupted. Successive generations of tech priests and Ultramarines technicians worked to replace failing components with newer alternatives while maintaining the field's essential functions. These modifications created a complex hybrid system that combined elements from different technological eras, held together by careful engineering and constant vigilance. The spiritual significance of Guilliman's preservation extended far beyond Ultramar, influencing imperial culture and religious practices throughout the galaxy. The image of the sleeping Primarch became a powerful symbol of endurance and hope, representing humanity's ability to survive even the most devastating setbacks while maintaining faith in eventual victory. Imperial Guard regiments carried images of the preserved Primarch into battle, drawing strength from his example of duty and sacrifice. The ecclesiarchy incorporated references to Guilliman's vigil into their liturgies, presenting his preservation as evidence of the Emperor's continuing protection of humanity through his chosen servants. The scholarly debates that surrounded Guilliman's condition reflected the broader intellectual struggles that characterized imperial civilization during the Age of Strife. Medical researchers and theologians argued about whether his preservation represented a miracle of imperial technology or divine intervention by the Emperor himself. Some scholars suggested that the stasis field had been blessed by the Emperor's psychic presence, transforming it from a mere technological device into a sacred relic with properties that transcended scientific understanding. These debates remained largely academic, as the practical reality of Guilliman's preservation continued regardless of the theoretical explanations proposed for its success. The security measures protecting the shrine evolved continuously throughout the millennia, adapting to new threats while maintaining the accessibility that allowed pilgrims to visit their preserved Primarch. Multiple layers of defense surrounded the Fortress of Hera, ranging from orbital monitoring stations that could detect approaching threats from across the system to close-range weapon systems capable of engaging individual infiltrators within the fortress walls. The Ultramarines developed specialized protocols for dealing with different types of threats, from conventional military attacks to chaos incursions that might attempt to corrupt or destroy the stasis field through supernatural means. The 13th Black Crusade erupted from the Eye of Terror with a fury that dwarfed all previous incursions launched by Abaddon the Despoiler. For 10,000 years, the War Master of Chaos had prepared for this moment, gathering the scattered remnants of the traitor legions, while forging alliances with demon princes and alien warlords who shared his hatred of the Imperium. The scale of the assault defied comprehension, with entire fleets of corrupted warships emerging from the warp storms that shrouded the Eye's boundaries. These vessels bore the scars of millennia spent within the realm of chaos, their hulls twisted into blasphemous configurations that hurt the mind to observe, while bristling with weapons that drew power directly from the Imperium itself. The fortress world of Cadia, that ancient bastion which had guarded the Cadian Gate for over 10 millennia, found itself facing an assault that exceeded every previous test of its defenses. The planet's surface bristled with defensive installations that had been refined and strengthened through countless generations of warfare, creating overlapping fields of fire that could destroy entire invasion fleets before they reached the upper atmosphere. Massive orbital defense platforms surrounded the world like artificial moons, their weapon batteries capable of engaging targets at ranges that approached the edge of the system itself. The Cadian shock troops, renowned throughout the galaxy for their discipline and marksmanship, manned positions that their ancestors had held against previous Black Crusades, while preparing to add another chapter to their regiment's legendary history. Abaddon's strategy for the 13th Black Crusade revealed the tactical genius that had made him the undisputed leader of the Chaos Space Marines. Rather than attempting to overwhelm Cadia through brute force alone, he coordinated simultaneous attacks across multiple sectors, stretching Imperial defenses beyond their breaking point, while preventing reinforcements from concentrating at any single threatened location. The Black Legion struck at Forge worlds throughout the Segmentum Obscurus, crippling the industrial capacity needed to supply the defenders while capturing the resources necessary to sustain their own offensive operations. Demon engines materialized within heavily defended systems, their supernatural abilities allowing them to bypass conventional defensive measures while sowing terror among Imperial forces unprepared for such otherworldly threats. The Blackstone fortresses that Abaddon had captured during previous crusades proved decisive in breaking Cadia's orbital defenses. These ancient constructs, originally built by the Eldar during their war against the Necrons, possessed firepower that could crack open planets while remaining immune to most conventional weapons. The fortresses moved through space with ponderous inevitability, their massive bulk protected by void shields that could absorb the combined fire of entire Imperial battle fleets without sustaining significant damage. Their main weapons channeled the raw energy of the warp itself, creating beams of destruction that could penetrate any known form of armor or shielding while leaving areas of reality distortion in their wake. The siege of Cadia lasted for months, with both sides pouring reinforcements into a battle that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Imperial Guard regiments from across the Imperium answered the call for aid, their troop transports running the gauntlet of chaos fleets that controlled increasing portions of the system's outer reaches. Space Marine chapters committed their full strength to the defense, with ancient rivals fighting side by side against an enemy that threatened everything they had sworn to protect. The Imperial Navy's battleships dueled with corrupted vessels that had once served the Emperor's cause, their crews forced to fire upon ships they had served alongside during the Great Crusade, while watching former brothers in arms transformed into monsters by 10 millennia of chaos worship. The final assault on Cadia began when Abaddon directed one of the Blackstone fortresses to ram the planet's surface, using the ancient construct as a kinetic weapon of unimaginable destructive power. The impact created seismic disturbances that shattered tectonic plates across entire continents, while the fortress's destruction released energies that tore holes in reality itself. The planet's crust cracked like an eggshell, exposing the molten core to the void while creating massive gravitational anomalies that pulled debris and atmosphere into swirling vortexes of destruction. Cadia's death throes lasted for days, with the world's final defenders fighting to the last moment, even as the ground beneath their feet dissolved into component atoms. The destruction of Cadia created a catastrophic resonance within the warp that propagated across the galaxy at faster than light speeds. The planet had served as more than just a strategic stronghold. Its unique position at the mouth of the Cadian Gate had made it a focal point for psychic energies that helped stabilize warp travel throughout the surrounding sectors. The sudden elimination of this stabilizing influence created a cascade failure in the Imperium structure, tearing open a massive rift that stretched from the Eye of Terror to the galactic core. This great rift, known to Imperial scholars as the Cicatrix Maledictum, divided the galaxy into two distinct regions, while making interstellar travel and communication exponentially more dangerous than it had been since the Age of Strife. The immediate consequences of the Great Rift's formation were felt across every inhabited world in the galaxy. Astropathic communication, already unreliable due to the Astronomican's weakening signal, became virtually impossible across the rift's breadth. Entire sectors found themselves cut off from higher Imperial authority, forced to make critical decisions based on outdated intelligence, while facing threats they could not properly assess or coordinate against. Navigator houses reported that their members were suffering unprecedented casualties as they attempted to guide ships through warp currents that had become violently unstable, with some vessels emerging from the Imperium decades or centuries after their intended arrival, while others simply vanished without trace. The Imperium Nihilus, that portion of the galaxy trapped on the far side of the Great Rift from Terra, faced challenges that tested the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. Cut off from the Astronomican's guiding light and unable to receive reinforcements or supplies from the Imperium's heartland, these isolated worlds were forced to rely entirely on their own resources while facing increased demon incursions and chaos cult uprisings. Some sectors descended into anarchy as local governments collapsed under the strain of constant warfare, while others implemented martial law so strict that civilian populations lived under conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. The few remaining loyalist Space Marine chapters in the region found themselves stretched beyond their operational limits, forced to abandon some worlds entirely in order to maintain effective defense of others. The crisis that engulfed the galaxy created conditions that would have been unthinkable during the Imperium's earlier history. Demon princes materialized on heavily populated worlds, their presence creating reality, storms that transformed entire continents into landscapes that defied physical laws. Chaos Space Marine warbands emerged from the Great Rift to claim territory that had been under Imperial control for millennia, establishing fortress worlds from which they could launch further raids against surrounding systems. The very fabric of space-time became unstable in some regions, creating temporal anomalies where cause and effect operated according to the whims of chaos gods rather than natural law. On distant Ultramar, the effects of the Great Rift manifested as a series of increasingly violent warp storms that threatened to isolate the 500 worlds from the rest of the galaxy. The Ultramarines found themselves facing demon incursions on a scale not seen since the Horus Heresy, with entire companies deployed to contain breaches in reality that allowed entities from the Imperium to manifest in the physical universe. Chapter Master Marnius Calgar coordinated the defense of multiple worlds simultaneously, his strategic genius tested by an enemy that operated according to no rational tactical doctrine, while possessing capabilities that exceeded anything in Imperial military manuals. The Shrine of Guilliman became a focal point for desperate prayers as the crisis deepened, with pilgrims arriving from across Ultramar to seek guidance from their preserved Primarch. The stasis field that had maintained Guilliman's preservation for 10 millennia began exhibiting unusual fluctuations that the Shrine's tech priest guardians could not explain through conventional analysis. Electromagnetic readings suggested that something within the field was responding to the galaxy-wide psychic disturbances created by the Great Rift's formation, though the nature of this response remained beyond current understanding. Some observers reported that Guilliman's expression appeared to be changing, his features showing signs of awareness that suggested consciousness within his suspended state. The arrival of the Inari at Ma Crag came without warning or advance communication, their sleek craft materializing from the webway with technology that bypassed every defensive system protecting the Ultramar capital. The delegation consisted of representatives from multiple Eldar factions united under the banner of Ennead, the nascent god of the dead whose awakening promised to free their species from the eternal threat of Slaanish's hunger. Ivrain, the emissary of Ennead and former succubus of the Dark Eldar, led the group with an authority that commanded respect from beings who had spent millennia as bitter enemies of each other. The Visarch, Ivrain's companion and the chosen sword arm of Ennead, carried weapons that hummed with barely contained power, while his armor bore the scars of countless battles fought in the service of his nascent god. The Unkarn, a manifestation of Ennead's growing power, accompanied them as a being of pure psychic energy, contained within a form that shifted between solid matter and ethereal essence depending on the observer's perception. These beings represented something unprecedented in the galaxy's history, Eldar united by common purpose rather than divided by ancient grudges and competing philosophies. The Ultramarines' response to the Inari delegation reflected the disciplined training that had characterized the chapter for 10 millennia. Despite the natural suspicion that any Imperial force would feel towards Xeno's intruders, the Marines maintained tactical awareness while avoiding actions that might precipitate unnecessary violence. Captain Sicarius, commanding the honor guard that intercepted the delegation, recognized that these aliens possessed capabilities far beyond normal Eldar parameters, while demonstrating knowledge of Ultramarines' protocols that suggested extensive intelligence gathering. The tension in the air was palpable as two species that had fought each other for millennia found themselves in close proximity without immediate hostile intent. Ivrain's proposal to heal Guilliman, using the power of Ennead, represented a gamble that could either save the Imperium or damn it to an even worse fate than the one it currently faced. The emissary explained that the Great Rift's formation had created conditions that made such healing possible, as the massive psychic disturbance had weakened the barriers between life and death that normally prevented such interventions. Ennead's growing power, fed by the deaths of countless Eldar over the millennia, could potentially purge the spiritual poison that had kept Guilliman in stasis while restoring his connection to the Emperor's essence. However, the process would require direct contact between Eldar psychers and the Primarch's preserved form, creating risks that could result in corruption or death for all involved. The debate that followed Ivrain's proposal revealed deep philosophical divisions within the Ultramarines' leadership about the appropriate response to such an unprecedented situation. Some officers argued that accepting aid from Xenos, regardless of their stated intentions, violated fundamental principles of Imperial doctrine and risked corrupting their Primarch through alien influence. Others contended that the galaxy's current crisis demanded consideration of options that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances, pointing out that conventional Imperial methods had failed to heal Guilliman despite 10 millennia of effort. The discussion continued for hours as each side presented arguments based on duty, pragmatism, and the potential consequences of action or inaction. Chapter Master Calgar's decision to permit the attempt reflected his understanding of the desperate situation facing not just Ultramar, but the entire Imperium. The Great Rift had created conditions that threatened humanity's survival as a species, while the increasing frequency of demon incursions suggested that conventional defensive measures would prove inadequate against the forces now arrayed against Imperial civilization. The chapter master recognized that preserving doctrinal purity meant little if there was no Imperium left to defend, while Guilliman's return might provide the leadership and inspiration necessary to rally humanity's scattered forces against their enemies. The preparation for Guilliman's healing required modifications to the shrine that had housed his preserved form for 10,000 years. The stasis field generators were carefully recalibrated to allow controlled access to the temporal distortion field while maintaining the essential functions that had kept the Primarch alive. Ivrain and her companions studied the chamber's architecture and technology with professional interest, their enhanced senses detecting energy patterns and structural elements that had escaped notice by human observers. The Eldar's understanding of psychic phenomena provided insights into the stasis field's operation that revealed previously unknown aspects of its function and maintenance. The ritual that would attempt to heal Guilliman combined Eldar psychic techniques with careful manipulation of the technological systems that had preserved him for so long. Ivrain positioned herself at the foot of the throne, while the Unkarn took a stance that allowed it to channel Ennead's power directly into the chamber's psychic matrix. The Visarch maintained a defensive position, his weapons ready to respond to any threat that might emerge during the delicate process of spiritual healing. The assembled Ultramarines watched with mixture of hope and apprehension as their ancient enemies prepared to attempt something that their own technology and medical knowledge had deemed impossible. The moment when Ivrain began channeling Ennead's power created visible distortions in the air around Guilliman's preserved form. The stasis field flickered and wavered as energies that existed partially outside normal space-time interacted with the technological systems that had maintained temporal suspension for millennia. Psychic lightning arced between the emissary's outstretched hands and the Primarch's motionless body, each discharge accompanied by changes in the chamber's atmosphere that made breathing difficult for the human observers. The Anathame's poison, dormant for 10,000 years, began reacting to the influx of life energy with violent resistance that manifested as visible corruption spreading across Guilliman's armor and exposed skin. The battle between Ennead's healing power and the Chaos Weapon's spiritual poison played out on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. In the physical realm, Guilliman's body convulsed as competing energies fought for dominance over his enhanced physiology, his breathing becoming labored while his heart struggled to maintain circulation against the toxin's interference. On the psychic level, the confrontation resembled a war between fundamental forces of creation and entropy, with Ennead's life giving essence clashing against the weapon's corrupting influence in ways that created feedback loops throughout the chamber's spiritual matrix. The Unkarn's form became increasingly solid as it channeled more power into the healing process, its ethereal nature stabilizing into something approaching physical existence as Ennead's influence grew stronger. The purification process continued for what felt like hours, but may have been minutes or days within the temporal distortion created by the conflicting energies. Ivrain's concentration never wavered despite the obvious strain of channeling power that threatened to overwhelm her physical form, while the Unkarn maintained its focus on directing Ennead's essence into the specific patterns necessary to counter the anatheme's corruption. The chamber's technological systems registered energy readings that exceeded their design parameters, yet continued functioning through a combination of superior engineering and what could only be described as divine intervention. The moment when Guilliman's eyes opened marked the successful completion of a healing that had seemed impossible for 10 millennia. The Primarch's first breath drew air that tasted of ozone and psychic discharge, while his enhanced senses immediately began processing information about his surroundings and the beings who had gathered to witness his awakening. His initial movements were cautious, testing the responsiveness of muscles that had been held in temporal suspension for longer than most civilizations had existed. The corruption that had spread across his armor during the healing process faded like frost before sunlight, leaving behind the pristine blue and gold that had marked him as Lord of the 13th Legion. Guilliman's first words upon awakening reflected his immediate assessment of the situation rather than wonder at his resurrection. His analytical mind processed the presence of Eldar in his shrine, the obvious signs of recent combat damage on his Space Marines equipment, and the subtle changes in technology and architecture that indicated the passage of significant time. The Primarch's questions were precise and focused, seeking to understand the current strategic situation before addressing the circumstances of his healing or the identity of those who had made it possible. His bearing remained regal, despite the obvious disorientation of awakening to find the galaxy transformed beyond recognition. The reality of the 42nd Millennium struck Guilliman with the force of a physical blow, as his subordinates provided detailed briefings about the Imperium's current condition. The Emperor's entombment within the Golden Throne, sustained only by the daily sacrifice of thousands of psychers, represented a perversion of everything the Master of Mankind had fought to achieve during the Great Crusade. The transformation of the imperial truth into the ecclesiarchy's religious dogma violated fundamental principles that Guilliman had helped establish, while the Imperium's technological decline suggested a civilization in terminal decay rather than the expanding empire he had left behind. The Adeptus Ministerum's elevation to one of the Imperium's most powerful institutions horrified Guilliman more than any battlefield defeat could have done. The very existence of an official state religion dedicated to worshiping the Emperor as a god contradicted everything his father had taught about humanity's need to reject superstition in favor of rational thought. The ecclesiarchy's Frateris Templar and later, the Adeptus Sororitas represented military forces answerable to religious rather than secular authority, creating the potential for conflicts between faith and reason that could tear the Imperium apart from within. The reports of religious wars fought between different interpretations of imperial doctrine suggested that such conflicts were not merely theoretical possibilities, but ongoing realities. The Inquisition's methods and authority structure revealed how far the Imperium had moved from the principles of justice and due process that had characterized imperial law during Guilliman's era. The organization's license to investigate, judge, and execute anyone suspected of heresy or corruption created a system where fear replaced trust as the foundation of imperial governance. The Inquisition's willingness to destroy entire worlds to prevent the spread of chaos corruption demonstrated a mentality that valued ideological purity over human life, while their factional conflicts suggested that even this extreme organization was not immune to the political divisions that plagued the broader Imperium. The Space Marine chapter's fragmentation into independent organizations following the second founding, represented both a validation of Guilliman's organizational reforms and a source of ongoing concern about their effectiveness. The Codex Astartes had successfully prevented any single Space Marine force from accumulating the power necessary to threaten Imperial unity, but the resulting dispersal of strength had also made it difficult to coordinate large-scale operations against major threats. Some chapters had developed customs and practices that diverged significantly from Guilliman's original intentions, while others had embraced interpretations of the Codex that elevated its tactical guidelines to the level of religious doctrine. The technological regression that had transformed the Adeptus Mechanicus from innovators into conservative guardians of ancient knowledge represented one of the most troubling aspects of the Imperium's decline. The replacement of scientific method with religious ritual in maintaining and operating Imperial technology suggested a civilization that had lost the ability to understand its own tools. The tech priests' veneration of machine spirits and their reluctance to develop new technologies indicated a mindset that valued tradition over progress, creating conditions where vital knowledge could be lost forever if the wrong person died or the right data core was destroyed. The political opposition that Guilliman faced upon his return manifested in subtle ways that reflected the complex power structures that had evolved during his absence. High Lords of Terra who had grown accustomed to ruling without Primarch oversight viewed his return as a threat to their authority and independence. Ecclesiastical leaders questioned whether a being who had been preserved through Zeno's intervention could still be considered pure enough to lead Imperial forces. Some Imperial Guard commanders expressed private doubts about following orders from someone who had been absent during 10 millennia of constant warfare, while their regiments bled and died defending worlds he had never seen. The religious fanaticism that had replaced the secular rationalism of the Great Crusade created challenges that Guilliman had never anticipated during his original service to the Emperor. Populations that viewed him as a living saint expected miracles and divine intervention rather than practical leadership and military competence. Shrine worlds dedicated to his worship had developed elaborate theological frameworks that explained his preservation and return in terms of divine providence rather than advanced technology and alien intervention. The cognitive dissonance between Guilliman's actual nature as a genetically enhanced human and his perceived status as a holy figure created ongoing tensions that affected every aspect of his interaction with Imperial society. The dark Imperium that existed beyond the Great Rift represented challenges that exceeded even the desperate conditions that had prompted Guilliman's awakening. Cut off from Terra's authority and the Astronomicans' guidance, these isolated regions had developed their own methods of survival that often contradicted established Imperial doctrine. Some worlds had formed alliances with alien species out of necessity, while others had implemented governmental systems that bore little resemblance to standard Imperial administration. The question of how to reintegrate these divergent populations into a unified Imperium would require careful consideration of both practical limitations and ideological principles. The magnitude of the crisis facing humanity demanded a response that would dwarf even the Great Crusade in scope and ambition. Guilliman's strategic assessment of the galactic situation revealed threats on a scale that required immediate and decisive action across multiple fronts simultaneously. The Great Rift had effectively severed the Imperium in half, creating isolated pockets of human civilization that faced extinction without coordinated support. Demon incursions erupted with unprecedented frequency as the barrier between real space and the warp weakened, while Chaos Space Marine warbands emerged from the Eye of Terror to claim territories that had remained loyal for 10 millennia. The Xenos races, sensing weakness in humanity's defenses, launched their own opportunistic campaigns to reclaim worlds lost during the Great Crusade. The Primarch's analysis identified the need for a military response that could operate effectively on both sides of the Great Rift, while establishing new supply lines and communication networks to replace those severed by the Galactic Schism. Traditional Imperial doctrine emphasized defensive strategies that relied on fortified positions and gradual attrition of enemy forces. But such approaches would prove inadequate against threats that could manifest anywhere in the galaxy without warning. The new campaign would require unprecedented mobility and firepower, capable of responding to crises across vast distances while maintaining the logistical support necessary for sustained operations in hostile territory. The revelation of the Primaris Space Marines project fundamentally altered Guilliman's understanding of what resources were available for the coming crusade. Belisarius calls 10,000-year effort to improve upon the Emperor's original Astartes design had produced warriors who exceeded their predecessors in every measurable category. These enhanced Space Marines possessed additional organs that improved their survivability and combat effectiveness, while their equipment incorporated technological advances that had been developed in secret during the long millennia of Imperial decline. The scale of Call's achievement became apparent as production facilities across Mars and its Forge World allies began delivering Primaris Marines in numbers that approached the strength of entire chapters. Guilliman's initial reaction to the Primaris project reflected the complex emotions of a being who had awakened to find his life's work both validated and superseded by forces beyond his control. The Codex Astartes had established organizational structures and tactical doctrines based on the capabilities and limitations of traditional Space Marines, yet these new warriors possessed abilities that could render many of those principles obsolete. The Primarch recognized the military advantages that Primaris Marines would provide, but he also understood the potential for disruption within existing chapter hierarchies, as veteran Astartes found themselves outmatched by newcomers who had never proven themselves in actual combat. The integration challenges posed by introducing Primaris Marines into established chapters required careful consideration of both practical and psychological factors. Traditional Space Marines who had served for centuries might resent being replaced by enhanced warriors, while chapter masters faced difficult decisions about how to incorporate new capabilities into existing command structures. Some chapters embraced the Primaris reinforcements enthusiastically, viewing them as essential tools for surviving the galaxy's current crisis. Others approached the integration with suspicion, questioning whether these enhanced warriors truly embodied the same values and traditions that had defined their chapter's identity for millennia. Call's presentation of the Primaris project revealed the extraordinary scope of preparation that had been conducted in absolute secrecy for 10,000 years. Hidden facilities throughout the galaxy had been producing equipment, training cadres, and refining genetic templates while maintaining the pretense of conducting routine mechanicus research. The Archmagos had anticipated not just the technical challenges of creating superior Space Marines, but also the logistical requirements for deploying them across the galaxy in sufficient numbers to make a strategic difference. Transport ships specifically designed for Primaris operations had been constructed and positioned at key locations, while ammunition and equipment stockpiles had been established to support extended campaigns. The Primarch's examination of Primaris capabilities revealed improvements that addressed many of the limitations that had constrained traditional Space Marine operations. The additional organs enhanced their resistance to toxins and environmental hazards while improving their ability to operate in hostile conditions without life support equipment. Their enhanced strength and reflexes made them more effective in close combat, while their improved cognitive functions enabled better tactical coordination and decision-making under stress. The new armor patterns and weapon systems provided superior protection and firepower while maintaining the mobility that had always been essential to Space Marine tactics. The strategic implications of deploying Primaris Marines on a galactic scale required fundamental revisions to Imperial military doctrine. These enhanced warriors could undertake missions that would have required entire companies of traditional Space Marines, enabling smaller forces to achieve objectives that previously demanded major deployments. Their improved survivability meant that they could operate in environments that would have been lethal to their predecessors, opening new tactical possibilities for operations in demon-infested regions or worlds corrupted by chaos influence. The enhanced coordination capabilities of Primaris Marines enabled more complex tactical maneuvers, while their improved equipment allowed for sustained operations in areas where resupply would be difficult or impossible. The launch of the Adeptus Crusade required coordination between military forces, industrial production, and logistical support on a scale that tested the limits of Imperial administrative capabilities. Guilliman established command centers throughout Ultramar and the surrounding sectors, each responsible for coordinating specific aspects of the massive undertaking. Fleet elements were assembled from across the galaxy, with ancient warships emerging from storage facilities where they had waited for millennia, alongside newly constructed vessels that incorporated the most advanced technology available to the Imperium. The mobilization process revealed both the impressive industrial capacity that the Imperium retained and the serious deficiencies in coordination and communication that had developed during the long years of fragmented authority. The selection of initial targets for the Adeptus Crusade reflected Guilliman's strategic priorities and his understanding of the psychological impact that early victories would have on Imperial morale. The campaign needed to demonstrate immediate results that would inspire confidence among Imperial forces while striking at enemy positions that posed the greatest threat to human survival. Demon worlds that served as staging areas for chaos incursions received priority targeting, as their elimination would reduce the frequency and scale of attacks against loyal Imperial territories. Forge worlds that had fallen to traitor forces represented critical objectives whose recapture would restore industrial capacity essential for sustaining the broader war effort. The liberation of Baal marked one of the Adeptus Crusade's most significant early victories and demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated operations between Primaris and traditional Space Marines. The Blood Angels' homeworld had been under siege by Hive Fleet Leviathan for months, with the chapter's remaining forces making desperate last stands in the ruins of their fortress monastery, while tyrannid bioforms consumed everything organic on the planet's surface. The arrival of Guilliman's relief force provided the firepower and reinforcements necessary to break the siege, while Primaris Marines proved their worth in the brutal close quarters fighting that characterized anti-tyrannid operations. The battle for Baal's surface revealed the tactical advantages that Primaris Marines provided in operations against tyrannid forces. Their enhanced strength allowed them to engage larger bioforms in melee combat, while their improved reflexes enabled them to respond effectively to the swarm tactics employed by smaller tyrannid organisms. The new bolt rifle variants proved particularly effective against tyrannid carapace armor, delivering explosive rounds with sufficient penetrating power to kill creatures that would have required heavy weapons fire from traditional bolters. The Primaris Marines' enhanced endurance enabled them to maintain combat effectiveness during the extended engagements that characterized fighting against Hive fleet elements. The psychological impact of Baal's liberation extended far beyond the immediate military significance of the victory. The Blood Angels had been among the most respected chapters in the Imperium, their noble reputation and heroic sacrifices inspiring countless Imperial Guard regiments and planetary defense forces throughout the galaxy. The prospect of their extinction at the hands of the Tyrannids had created a sense of despair that threatened to undermine morale across entire sectors. Guilliman's successful intervention demonstrated that even the most desperate situations could be reversed through proper coordination and the application of superior resources, providing hope to other besieged Imperial forces. The integration of surviving Blood Angels with their Primaris reinforcements proceeded more smoothly than many observers had anticipated, largely due to Commander Dante's leadership and his recognition of the practical necessities facing his chapter. The chapter master's legendary wisdom and diplomatic skills enabled him to address the concerns of veteran Blood Angels, while ensuring that the new arrivals understood and respected the chapter's traditions and combat doctrines. The shared experience of fighting side by side against the Tyranids created bonds between traditional and Primaris Marines that transcended the technical differences in their capabilities and equipment. The defense of Vigilus represented a different type of challenge that tested the Indomitus Crusade's ability to coordinate multiple simultaneous operations while maintaining strategic flexibility. The Forge world served as a critical junction point for shipping routes that connected dozens of systems, making its control essential for maintaining supply lines to Imperial forces operating throughout the region. The planet faced attacks from multiple enemies simultaneously, with Orc Wayags, Chaos Space Marine warbands, and Genestealer cults all seeking to claim the world's industrial capacity for their own purposes. The complex tactical situation required careful coordination between different Imperial forces while preventing any single enemy faction from achieving decisive advantage. The Vigilus campaign demonstrated the importance of intelligence gathering and analysis in modern Imperial warfare. The planet's defenders faced enemies who employed fundamentally different tactical doctrines and strategic objectives, requiring constant adaptation of defensive plans as new threats emerged or existing ones evolved. Genestealer cult infiltrators had compromised security throughout the world's industrial complexes, creating vulnerabilities that enemy forces could exploit while feeding intelligence to Tyranid Hive fleet elements approaching the system. Chaos Space Marine forces employed demon allies whose supernatural abilities rendered conventional defensive measures ineffective, while Orc forces operated with typical disregard for casualties or logical tactical objectives. The deployment of Primaris Marines to Vigilus revealed their advantages in urban warfare environments where traditional Space Marine tactics required modification for confined spaces and civilian populations. The enhanced warriors' improved coordination capabilities enabled them to conduct complex multi-level operations within the world's massive hive cities, while their superior equipment provided better protection against the improvised weapons and booby traps that characterized fighting against insurgent forces. The new grav tanks and repulsor vehicles proved particularly effective in urban environments, their ability to hover over obstacles and debris fields providing tactical mobility that traditional tracked vehicles could not match. The logistical challenges of supporting operations on both sides of the Great Rift required innovative solutions that pushed Imperial supply doctrine beyond its established limitations. Traditional resupply methods relied on regular shipping routes protected by naval patrols and supported by established depot worlds that could provide fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment as needed. The Great Rift had severed many of these routes while creating new hazards that made warp travel exponentially more dangerous than it had been during previous centuries. Guilliman's staff developed new protocols for establishing forward supply bases in contested systems while creating redundant supply chains that could continue functioning even when individual routes were compromised. The establishment of the Torchbearer fleets represented one of the most ambitious logistical undertakings in Imperial history, with each fleet carrying sufficient supplies and personnel to reinforce multiple Space Marine chapters, while establishing new recruitment and training facilities in previously unsupported regions. These fleets operated with unprecedented autonomy, empowered to make strategic decisions without waiting for authorization from higher command levels, while maintaining coordination with the broader Crusade objectives. The fleet commanders received extensive briefings on political conditions throughout their operational areas, enabling them to adapt their approach based on local circumstances while maintaining consistency with overall Imperial policy. The coordination of naval operations across such vast distances required new communication protocols that could function despite the interference created by warp storms and demon incursions. Guilliman's staff established a network of astropathic relay stations that could maintain contact between widely separated fleet elements while providing early warning of emerging threats. These stations operated under constant threat of attack, requiring significant defensive resources while providing essential intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. The successful establishment and maintenance of this communication network proved crucial for coordinating the complex multi-front operations that characterized the Adeptus Crusade. The strategic challenges of commanding operations on both sides of the Great Rift forced Guilliman to delegate authority to subordinate commanders in ways that would have been impossible during the Great Crusade. The communication delays and travel restrictions imposed by the Galactic Schism meant that detailed tactical control from a central headquarters was simply not feasible for many operations. Fleet commanders and chapter masters received broad strategic objectives along with the resources necessary to achieve them, but they were expected to develop their own tactical plans based on local conditions and intelligence. This decentralized command structure required careful selection of subordinate leaders while creating new challenges for maintaining strategic coordination. The emergence of new demon princes and greater demons as opponents during the Adeptus Crusade revealed the extent to which chaos forces had grown in power during the millennia following the Horus Heresy. These entities possessed capabilities that exceeded anything documented in Imperial military manuals, requiring the development of new tactics and specialized equipment for engaging supernatural opponents. Primaris Marines proved more resistant to demonic corruption than their traditional counterparts, but even they required careful preparation and spiritual protection when operating in areas where the barrier between real space and the warp had been weakened by prolonged chaos presence. The industrial mobilization required to support the Adeptus Crusade revealed both the impressive productive capacity that the Imperium retained and the serious inefficiencies that had developed during millennia of bureaucratic expansion and technological stagnation. Forge worlds that had operated at reduced capacity for centuries suddenly found themselves required to increase production by orders of magnitude while maintaining quality standards essential for military equipment. The coordination between different Mechanicus factions proved challenging, as competing interpretations of doctrine and rivalry between Forge worlds sometimes interfered with efficient resource allocation and production scheduling. The elevation of Guilliman to the position of Lord Commander of the Imperium marked the beginning of the most comprehensive reform effort the galaxy had witnessed since the Great Crusade itself. The Primarch's return to active leadership came at a moment when the Imperium's ancient institutions had calcified into bureaucratic nightmares that prioritized procedure over effectiveness, creating administrative bottlenecks that could delay critical military decisions for months or even years. The High Lords of Terra, accustomed to ruling through committee consensus and political maneuvering, found themselves confronted by a figure who possessed both the legal authority and practical capability to override their established power structures. Guilliman's first acts as Lord Commander focused on streamlining command hierarchies that had become so convoluted that orders from Terra might take decades to reach their intended recipients. The resistance to Guilliman's reforms manifested most strongly within the Adeptus Administratum, where countless generations of bureaucrats had built careers on maintaining and expanding the labyrinthine procedures that governed imperial administration. Scribes who had spent centuries perfecting their knowledge of obscure regulations suddenly found their expertise rendered obsolete by new directives that emphasized results over process. The Primarch's systematic elimination of redundant administrative layers threatened entire hierarchies of officials whose positions existed primarily to oversee other officials in an endless cycle of bureaucratic oversight. Department heads who had never expected to be held accountable for actual outcomes discovered that their performance would be measured by concrete achievements rather than adherence to established protocols. The military reforms that Guilliman implemented drew upon his millennia of experience commanding Space Marine forces while adapting to the realities of the 42nd Millennium strategic environment. The fragmentation of Imperial military forces into competing organizations with overlapping responsibilities had created coordination problems that regularly resulted in friendly fire incidents and wasted resources. The Imperial Guard, Imperial Navy, and various Space Marine chapters often operated with conflicting objectives and incompatible communication systems, making joint operations extremely difficult to coordinate effectively. Guilliman's new command structures established clear chains of authority that eliminated ambiguity about operational control while creating standardized procedures for inter-service cooperation. The integration of Primaris Space Marines into existing chapter hierarchies required careful management of the political dynamics that had developed within individual chapters over millennia of independent operation. Veteran sergeants who had earned their positions through decades of combat experience found themselves outranked by Primaris Marines who possessed superior physical capabilities but lacked practical battlefield knowledge. Chapter masters faced difficult decisions about promoting traditional Marines to positions where they might be unable to keep pace with enhanced warriors, while simultaneously ensuring that Primaris Marines understood and respected the traditions that define their chapter's identity. Some chapters adapted to these changes more successfully than others, with the most flexible organizations finding ways to leverage the strengths of both Marine types while minimizing friction between different groups. The technological disparities between Primaris and traditional Space Marine equipment created additional challenges for chapter logistics and maintenance personnel. The new bolt rifles required different ammunition types and maintenance procedures than traditional bolters, while Primaris armor systems incorporated power sources and targeting systems that were unfamiliar to many chapter tech Marines. The repulsor vehicles that transported Primaris forces operated on gravitational manipulation principles that differed significantly from the tracked or wheeled vehicles that most chapters had used for millennia. Training programs had to be developed rapidly to ensure that support personnel could maintain and repair equipment they had never encountered before, while supply chains required modification to accommodate new ammunition types and replacement parts. The ecclesiarchy's opposition to Guilliman's reforms stemmed from fundamental theological disagreements about the emperor's nature and humanity's relationship with the divine. The Primarch's secular worldview, shaped by the imperial truth of the Great Crusade era, conflicted directly with the religious orthodoxy that had dominated imperial culture for 10,000 years. Cardinal Militant Bucephalus and other high-ranking ecclesiarchs argued that Guilliman's reforms threatened to undermine the faith that sustained imperial citizens through the hardships of their daily existence. They contended that removing religious elements from imperial governance would leave populations vulnerable to chaos corruption, as secular authorities lacked the spiritual authority necessary to combat demonic influence effectively. The theological debates surrounding Guilliman's status within imperial doctrine created complex challenges for ecclesiarchal authorities who had spent millennia developing elaborate frameworks that explained the Primarch's role in the emperor's divine plan. Some theologians argued that Guilliman's resurrection through alien intervention proved that he had been chosen by the emperor for a special mission that transcended normal imperial doctrine. Others contended that his preservation and awakening represented a test of imperial faith, requiring believers to choose between following ancient religious teachings and accepting guidance from a figure whose return challenged established theological principles. The most conservative factions within the ecclesiarchy questioned whether Guilliman's extended contact with Zeno's powers had compromised his spiritual purity, making him unsuitable for leadership roles within the Imperium. The Logos Historica Verita represented Guilliman's most ambitious attempt to combat the ignorance and superstition that had replaced rational thought throughout much of the Imperium. This massive historical research project aimed to recover accurate records of the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy while correcting the myths and legends that had distorted imperial understanding of its own past. Teams of scholars and archivists worked to compile primary source documents from scattered archives throughout the galaxy, cross-referencing different accounts to establish factual timelines of crucial events. The project faced enormous challenges in distinguishing between reliable historical records and propaganda documents created by various factions to support their political objectives. The resistance to the Logos Historica Verita came from multiple sources within imperial society, each with their own reasons for preferring mythologized versions of history to factual accounts. The ecclesiarchy opposed efforts to present the emperor as a secular leader rather than a divine figure, arguing that such interpretations undermine the spiritual foundations of imperial civilization. Space Marine chapters resisted attempts to correct heroic legends about their founding or early battles, viewing these stories as essential elements of their cultural identity, regardless of their historical accuracy. Planetary governors and noble families fought against research that might reveal embarrassing truths about their ancestors' roles during the heresy or their acquisition of current territories and titles. The practical challenges of conducting historical research in the 42nd millennium proved as difficult as the political opposition to the project. Many archives had been destroyed during the intervening millennia, either through warfare, natural disasters, or deliberate purges by authorities who preferred to eliminate inconvenient records. The documents that survived often existed in formats that required specialized equipment to access, while the languages and writing systems used during the Great Crusade had evolved significantly over 10,000 years. Some archives had been sealed by their original creators using security systems that defied modern attempts at access, while others had been corrupted by chaos influence or Xenos interference that made their contents unreliable. The scholars working on the Logos Historica Verita discovered that many supposedly historical accounts had been deliberately falsified by their original authors for political or religious purposes. Imperial propaganda from the Great Crusade era presented sanitized versions of events that omitted uncomfortable details about the emperor's methods or the Primarch's personalities. Post-heresy accounts often reflected the biases of their authors, with loyalist chroniclers demonizing the traitor Primarchs while ignoring the complex circumstances that had led to their rebellion. The project's researchers had to develop new methodologies for evaluating source reliability while accounting for the various motivations that might have influenced historical chroniclers. The revelation of suppressed historical truths created ongoing tensions between Guilliman and various imperial institutions that had built their authority on carefully maintained myths. The discovery that several Space Marine chapters had been founded using gene seed from traitor legions contradicted official records that claimed all loyalist chapters descended from the 9 loyal legions. Evidence that some worlds celebrated as exemplars of imperial virtue had actually collaborated with traitor forces during the heresy threatened to undermine the legitimacy of their current governments. The project uncovered instances where the Inquisition had deliberately destroyed historical records to prevent the spread of information they deemed dangerous to imperial stability. Guilliman's personal relationship with the Emperor during their psychic communion sessions revealed the profound changes that 10 millennia of entombment had wrought upon the master of mankind. The being that Guilliman encountered within the psychic realm bore little resemblance to the father he remembered from the Great Crusade, having been transformed by millennia of constant pain and the burden of maintaining the Astronomicon while fighting off demonic incursions into real space. The Emperor's consciousness existed in a state of constant flux, sometimes manifesting as the rational leader who had united Terra, while at other times appearing as a wrathful deity whose thoughts moved in patterns that defied human comprehension. The conversations between father and son during these psychic encounters revealed fundamental disagreements about the direction the Imperium should take in the face of its current crisis. The Emperor's perspective had been shaped by 10,000 years of observing humanity's struggles against chaos, Xenos threats, and internal corruption, leading him to conclusions that sometimes conflicted with Guilliman's more optimistic assessment of human potential. The Master of Mankind had witnessed the rise of the imperial cult and the transformation of his secular vision into a galaxy-spanning religion, yet his attitude toward these developments remained ambiguous and difficult for even Guilliman to interpret clearly. The psychological burden of these communications weighed heavily on Guilliman as he struggled to reconcile the being he encountered in the psychic realm with his memories of the Emperor from the Great Crusade era. The father who had once inspired absolute loyalty through his vision of human unity and rational governance had been replaced by something that existed on a level of consciousness far removed from normal human experience. The Emperor's responses to Guilliman's questions often came in the form of images, emotions, or concepts that required careful interpretation, making it difficult to determine whether his guidance represented considered advice or the random thoughts of a mind pushed beyond the limits of sanity by millennia of torment. The political implications of Guilliman's direct communication with the Emperor created additional challenges for his reform efforts, as various factions within the Imperium claimed that their interpretation of the Master of Mankind's will should take precedence over the Primarch's secular policies. Ecclesiarchal authorities argued that their religious doctrines represented the Emperor's true intentions, while inquisitors contended that their mandate to combat heresy and corruption gave them special insight into the Master of Mankind's priorities. The High Lords of Terra insisted that their collective authority derived from the Emperor's original establishment of their positions, making their decisions equivalent to direct imperial commands, regardless of Guilliman's personal communications with his father. The strain of serving as the primary conduit between the Emperor and the rest of the Imperium gradually took its toll on Guilliman's mental and emotional state. The responsibility of translating his father's often cryptic guidance into practical policies for governing a galaxy spanning civilization required constant vigilance and interpretation that left little time for personal reflection or recovery. The Primarch found himself increasingly isolated from his subordinates, as few individuals possessed the security clearance or psychological preparation necessary to discuss the true nature of his communications with the Emperor. The weight of making decisions that would affect trillions of lives, while knowing that his father's guidance might be compromised by 10 millennia of suffering, created a burden that even Primarch physiology struggled to bear. The administrative reforms that Guilliman implemented throughout the Imperium's governmental structure reflected his systematic approach to identifying and eliminating inefficiencies that had accumulated over millennia of bureaucratic expansion. Departments that existed solely to oversee other departments were consolidated or eliminated entirely, while reporting requirements that served no practical purpose were streamlined to focus on information that actually supported decision-making processes. The Primarch's background in governing Ultramar provided him with practical experience in managing large-scale administrative systems, but the scale and complexity of imperial bureaucracy exceeded even his considerable organizational capabilities. The resistance to administrative streamlining came primarily from mid-level bureaucrats whose positions would be eliminated by the reforms, creating a coalition of interests that worked to sabotage implementation through passive resistance and deliberate misinterpretation of new directives. These officials possessed detailed knowledge of existing procedures that made them difficult to replace quickly, while their understanding of bureaucratic networks enabled them to create delays and complications that frustrated reform efforts. Some departments implemented Guilliman's directives in ways that technically complied with his orders, while maintaining the inefficiencies he sought to eliminate, requiring constant oversight and correction that consumed valuable time and resources. The cultural changes required to support Guilliman's governmental reforms proved as challenging as the structural modifications themselves. Imperial society had developed over 10 millennia to accommodate and work within existing bureaucratic systems, creating expectations and behaviors that were difficult to modify through administrative decree alone. Citizens who had learned to navigate complex approval processes suddenly found themselves dealing with streamlined procedures that eliminated familiar checkpoints and verification steps. Local officials who had built their careers on understanding obscure regulations discovered that their expertise was no longer valued in a system that prioritized efficiency over procedural compliance. The expansion of Ultramar from its original 500 worlds to encompass multiple sectors represents one of the most significant territorial reorganizations in Imperial history since the Great Crusade itself. Guilliman's methodical approach to this expansion drew upon his millennia of experience in governing diverse populations, while adapting to the unique challenges posed by the galaxy's current fractured state. The new territories incorporated into Ultramar included forge worlds whose industrial capacity had been crippled by chaos raids, agricultural planets whose populations had been decimated by tyrannid incursions, and fortress worlds that had maintained their defenses through centuries of isolation beyond the Great Rift. Each world required careful assessment of its strategic value, defensive needs, and potential contribution to the broader war effort. The administrative integration of these new territories required the development of governance structures that could accommodate populations with vastly different cultural backgrounds and technological capabilities. Some worlds had maintained advanced industrial capacity throughout their isolation, while others had regressed to feudal societies that barely understood the basic principles of imperial technology. The Ultramarines established training cadres on each world to educate local administrators in Guilliman's governance principles, while respecting existing social structures that had proven effective in maintaining order and productivity. These programs emphasized practical competence over ideological purity, focusing on results that could be measured in terms of improved living conditions and increased contribution to imperial defense efforts. The economic benefits of Ultramar's expansion became apparent within years of the initial integration efforts. The inclusion of additional forge worlds provided manufacturing capacity that could support not just local defense needs, but also contribute to the broader Adeptus Crusade's logistical requirements. Agricultural worlds that had struggled to feed their populations under isolation found new markets for their surplus production, while gaining access to advanced farming techniques that increased their yields significantly. The establishment of secure shipping routes between Ultramar worlds created trade networks that generated prosperity, while providing the tax revenue necessary to fund expanded military forces and infrastructure improvements. The military advantages of the expanded Ultramar became evident as Guilliman implemented his vision of distributed defense networks that could respond rapidly to threats emerging anywhere within the region. Rather than concentrating forces at a few heavily fortified positions, the new structure established smaller garrisons throughout the territory that could provide immediate response to local threats while calling for reinforcement from neighboring systems when facing larger incursions. This approach required extensive coordination between different planetary defense forces and space marine units, but it provided coverage that made successful surprise attacks extremely difficult while ensuring that no single point of failure could compromise the entire region's security. The recruitment benefits of governing a larger territory provided the Ultramarines with access to genetic diversity that had been lacking when they drew candidates exclusively from Macragge and its immediate neighbors. The expanded recruitment base included populations that had developed unique adaptations to their local environments, providing gene seed compatibility with individuals who possessed enhanced resistance to radiation, improved reflexes developed through life in high-gravity environments, or enhanced cognitive abilities that resulted from generations of selection pressure in technologically advanced societies. This diversity strengthened the chapter's overall capabilities while providing backup options if any single recruitment world faced catastrophic population losses. Guilliman's long-term vision for imperial reform extends far beyond the immediate military necessities imposed by the galaxy's current crisis. The Primarch recognizes that the Imperium's survival depends not just on winning battles against external enemies, but on creating governmental and social structures capable of sustaining human civilization across the vast distances and time scales that characterize interstellar governance. His reforms aim to reverse the technological stagnation that has plagued imperial society for millennia, while eliminating the superstitious practices that have replaced rational decision-making in many areas of imperial administration. The ultimate goal involves creating an Imperium that can adapt to new challenges while maintaining the unity and purpose that have enabled humanity's survival in a hostile galaxy. The military reforms that Guilliman envisions would fundamentally alter how Imperial forces organize and coordinate their operations across multiple theaters of conflict. The current system, which divides military authority between the Imperial Guard, Imperial Navy, and various Space Marine chapters, creates coordination problems that regularly result in wasted resources and missed opportunities to achieve decisive victories against enemy forces. Guilliman's proposed reforms would establish unified command structures that could coordinate all Imperial military assets within specific regions, while maintaining the flexibility necessary to respond to rapidly changing tactical situations. These changes would require extensive modifications to existing chains of command and communication systems, but they would eliminate the jurisdictional disputes that currently hamper joint operations. The technological advancement programs that Guilliman supports represent a careful balance between encouraging innovation and maintaining the security protocols necessary to prevent chaos corruption of Imperial technology. The Primarch understands that the Imperium's technological stagnation has left it vulnerable to enemies who have continued developing new weapons and capabilities, while Imperial forces rely on designs that have remained essentially unchanged for millennia. However, he also recognizes the dangers posed by uncontrolled technological experimentation, as the men of Iron Rebellion and various Mechanicus heresies have demonstrated the catastrophic consequences that can result from insufficient oversight of advanced research programs. The collaboration between Guilliman and Belisarius Call on technological development projects reflects both the potential benefits and inherent risks of accelerated innovation programs. Call's success in developing Primaris Space Marines and their associated equipment demonstrates that significant improvements to Imperial military capabilities remain possible despite the constraints imposed by current doctrine and resource limitations. However, the Archmagos' methods often involve research into areas that other tech priests consider dangerously close to heretical innovation, creating ongoing tensions within the Adeptus Mechanicus about the appropriate balance between technological advancement and doctrinal purity. Guilliman's support for these projects provides political protection for controversial research while ensuring that new technologies undergo proper testing before widespread deployment. The gradual elimination of the Imperial cult's excesses represents perhaps the most challenging aspect of Guilliman's reform agenda, as it requires changing beliefs and practices that have become fundamental to Imperial culture over 10 millennia. The Primarch cannot simply abolish the ecclesiarchy through administrative decree, as doing so would create massive social disruption that could destabilize entire sectors while providing opportunities for chaos cults to exploit the resulting confusion and resentment. Instead, his approach involves gradually redirecting religious practices toward more rational interpretations of Imperial doctrine, while eliminating the most counterproductive aspects of current theological orthodoxy. The educational reforms that Guilliman promotes aim to restore scientific literacy and critical thinking skills to Imperial society while maintaining the moral frameworks that help resist chaos corruption. The current system, which emphasizes rote memorization of religious texts and unquestioning obedience to authority, produces populations that lack the intellectual tools necessary to adapt to changing circumstances or contribute meaningfully to technological advancement. The new curricula would include basic scientific principles, logical reasoning, and practical problem-solving skills alongside traditional religious instruction, creating citizens capable of both faithful service and rational decision-making when faced with novel challenges. The resistance to these educational reforms comes primarily from ecclesiarchal authorities who argue that encouraging independent thought will lead to heretical questioning of established doctrine and increased vulnerability to chaos influence. Conservative elements within the Adeptus Ministorum contend that the current system's emphasis on faith and obedience has successfully maintained Imperial unity for 10,000 years, making fundamental changes unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Some planetary governors also oppose educational reforms that might produce populations capable of questioning their authority or demanding better governance, preferring to maintain existing systems that ensure docile compliance with their directives. The current threats facing Guilliman and the Imperium require constant adaptation of strategic priorities as new enemies emerge, while existing opponents develop enhanced capabilities through alliance with chaos powers or technological advancement. Mortarian's plague wars represent an ongoing challenge that tests Imperial medical capabilities and quarantine procedures, while threatening to spread corruption throughout entire sectors. The Death Guard's use of demonic diseases that can infect both organic and mechanical systems creates problems that cannot be solved through conventional military responses, requiring the development of specialized equipment and tactics that can operate effectively in contaminated environments. The Plague Wars have revealed the extent to which chaos corruption can transform entire worlds into weapons against the Imperium, as infected populations become vectors for spreading supernatural diseases that defy medical understanding. Mortarian's forces have developed techniques for seeding planets with corruption that remains dormant for years before manifesting in ways that overwhelm local medical facilities and defense forces. The Death Guard's ability to corrupt Imperial supply chains means that even worlds that have never been directly attacked can find themselves facing outbreaks of demonic plagues delivered through contaminated food supplies or medical equipment. Abaddon's continued campaigns represent a different type of threat that combines traditional military capabilities with supernatural enhancement and strategic coordination that exceeds anything the traitor forces achieved during the original Horus Heresy. The War Master of Chaos has learned from his previous defeats, developing more sophisticated approaches to Imperial weaknesses while building alliances with Xeno's forces and demon princes that provide capabilities his own forces lack. The Black Legion's raids target critical infrastructure and key personnel rather than attempting to hold territory, creating maximum disruption with minimal resource commitment while forcing Imperial forces to spread their defenses across vast areas. The strategic coordination between different Chaos factions under Abaddon's leadership represents an unprecedented level of cooperation among forces that have traditionally competed with each other for resources and territory. The War Master has successfully negotiated agreements that allow different traitor legions to specialize in their preferred forms of warfare while contributing to larger strategic objectives that serve their common interests. This coordination enables Chaos forces to achieve effects that exceed the sum of their individual capabilities, while presenting Imperial defenders with multifaceted threats that cannot be countered through single-purpose responses. The ever-present threat of chaos corruption within Imperial society requires constant vigilance and adaptive countermeasures that must evolve as the enemy develops new methods of infiltration and subversion. Traditional approaches that rely primarily on inquisitorial investigation and purges have proven inadequate against sophisticated corruption campaigns that can operate undetected for decades while establishing deep roots within Imperial institutions. Guilliman's reforms include improved screening procedures for sensitive positions and enhanced training for personnel responsible for identifying signs of corruption. But these measures must be balanced against the need to maintain operational efficiency and avoid creating paranoid atmospheres that interfere with legitimate activities. The psychological warfare campaigns employed by Chaos forces have become increasingly sophisticated, targeting specific vulnerabilities within Imperial society while exploiting the communications networks and cultural practices that the Imperium requires for effective governance. Chaos cults use Imperial communication systems to spread propaganda that appears to come from legitimate sources while promoting interpretations of Imperial doctrine that gradually lead populations toward heretical beliefs. The corruption of Imperial cultural practices creates situations where traditional ceremonies and celebrations become vehicles for spreading chaos influence without participants realizing they are engaging in heretical activities. Speculation about Guilliman's ultimate fate must consider both his mortal nature and the monumental tasks that lie ahead in the grim darkness of the 42nd millennium. Despite his enhanced physiology and the healing he received from Ennead's power, the Primarch remains fundamentally mortal and subject to the limitations that constrain all biological beings. The stress of governing a galaxy-spanning civilization while simultaneously commanding military operations against multiple existential threats takes a toll that even Primarch Constitution cannot ignore indefinitely. The psychological burden of serving as humanity's primary hope for survival, while knowing that failure could result in the species' extinction, creates pressures that test the limits of even superhuman mental resilience. The possibility that Guilliman might eventually succumb to the accumulated stress of his responsibilities raises questions about succession planning and the continuity of his reform programs. The Primarch has worked to establish institutional frameworks that can function independently of his direct oversight, but many of his most important initiatives depend on his personal authority and the respect he commands from various imperial factions. The loss of Guilliman's leadership could result in the fragmentation of his coalition and the reversal of reforms that threaten established interests within imperial society. However, the precedent established by Guilliman's return from apparent death suggests that even mortal limitations may not represent absolute constraints on his ability to serve the Imperium's needs. The intervention of alien powers in his resurrection demonstrates that forces beyond normal imperial understanding take interest in humanity's survival and may be willing to act again if circumstances require such intervention. The growing power of Ennead and the continuing evolution of the galaxy's psychic environment create possibilities that did not exist during previous eras, potentially offering solutions to problems that would have been insurmountable under earlier conditions. The transformation of the galaxy itself through the Great Rift's formation and the increasing instability of the warp suggests that the 42nd millennium represents a period of fundamental change, rather than simply another crisis in the Imperium's long history of survival against overwhelming odds. The barriers between real space and the Imperium continue to weaken, creating opportunities for both corruption and transcendence that could fundamentally alter the nature of human civilization. Guilliman's role in guiding humanity through this transformation may prove more significant than his military victories or administrative reforms, as the species faces choices that will determine its ultimate destiny among the stars. The legacy that Guilliman creates through his current efforts will likely endure regardless of his personal fate, as the principles and institutions he establishes provide foundations for future leaders to build upon. The Primaris Space Marines represent a permanent enhancement to humanity's military capabilities, while the governmental reforms create precedents for more efficient and effective administration of imperial territories. The educational and technological advancement programs, if successfully implemented, could reverse millennia of stagnation and create populations capable of adapting to whatever challenges the future may bring. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, Roboute Guilliman stands as both humanity's greatest hope and its most burdened son. His return has provided the Imperium with leadership it desperately needed, while revealing the full extent of the challenges that must be overcome for human civilization to survive. Whether he ultimately succeeds in his monumental task or falls in the attempt, his efforts have already changed the galaxy's trajectory and provided inspiration for those who will continue the fight long after his name becomes legend once again.